Dating Dru by Raneé S. Clark. Copyright 2019 by Sweetly Us Press.
Chapter 1. Here you go. Best room in the house. Tag insisted. Bellamy, the pretty brunette manager of the ranch house, held open the door for Dru North to step through. He surveyed the room, grinning when he caught sight of the view. Tag had indeed told him about this. Said the views here would rival camping outside under the stars. And are most popular since we started advertising on the website that this is where Tag wrote most of the Roxy album. Dru widened his eyes in mock reverence and walked over to the gray sectional, dropping his duffel on the floor near the bed. Here. He pretended awe that had Bellamy smirking. Here. In this very spot, he penned the lyrics to that iconic song that still has half the teenage girls in America fainting, even a full year after its release. He hummed a few bars of a Roxy's song, making Bellamy all out laugh. The one and only. I knew I should have taken pictures or something. She shrugged, pretending that this lapse devastated her. I'm a little surprised, to be honest. Roxy talked like you were staying with them. She hovered in the doorway, watching Dru inspect the rest of the room. Taggart Du Bois, better known as Tag Turner in these parts, had invited him to spend the holiday at their house. His wife, Roxy, had reiterated it multiple times. He wouldn't have minded staying at Tag and Roxy's house, just down the road from the famous ranch house, but he wouldn't mind a couple days of complete solitude either. Over the last few years, Tag had become the closest thing Dru had to a best friend. He'd mentored Dru from the moment Dru started opening for him, and when Dru got just as big, Tag had easily transitioned into colleague. Accepting their invitation to spend Christmas in Little River was a given. He was dying to experience the big Christmas holiday celebrations Tag had described he and Roxy celebrating with her friends and family. But he didn't want to intrude too much. When Dru looked back at the door again, he caught Bellamy staring. She blinked and blushed, then looked away. He smiled. 2 years later, and that didn't get old. He wondered if the women would have looked as long back when his hair was short. He was clean-shaven, and he didn't have tats running up and down his left arm. He had never minded the bad boy, rock star persona that made him sell far more records than the clean-cut version of him had. His admirers seemed like it a lot too. It not only sold music but got him plenty of dates. His manager thought the playboy, country bachelor thing was great for the image too. Dru didn't typically argue. Even though sometimes the expectation that he was actually that man behind the stage persona wore thin. But Dru could wait patiently for the day a woman could see behind all that, the way Tag and Roxy had weathered their fair share of tabloid rumor-mongering and were still going strong. Bellamy cleared her throat. Let me know when you want dinner, and I'll have someone bring it up. Dru frowned. I thought that big Christmas party was tonight. The one all of Little River shows up to the ranch house for? Bellamy blinked at him, looking surprised. Oh. I didn't think you'd want to go to that. Some of our guests prefer the solitude. That's why they come to the ranch house. Dru nodded. Guests like Taggart Du Bois, before he married Roxy, and the other A-listers that had been coming to this small town to get away. Roxy made it sound nice. You don't need to cook another meal for me. Her cheeks darkened. Bellamy Hanson wasn't quite his type, but Dru had always enjoyed flirting. Wow. That's nice of you. But I don't mind. Dru couldn't help pushing up the sleeves of his shirt before he folded his arms across his chest, playing up the bad boy image. Bellamy's eyes darted to the ink there before going back to his face. Not what you expected, he smirked. She wagged a finger at him, her smile only widening. Oh no. Mr. North. I trust Tag far more than I trust anything I read in a magazine. I know you're a good guy. She put her hand on the doorknob and moved out into the hallway. Call me if you change your mind. The office number is on the card next to the phone, along with the Wi-Fi details. She nodded at a table next to the bed before shutting the door and leaving him. Dru chuckled as he picked his duffel back up and moved to put it on the luggage stand next to the dresser. Tag might have been right about Little River being the perfect place to escape from being Dru North, country rock star. Chapter 2. Amber Miller steeled herself for the arguments as soon as she picked up her suitcase to roll it out the door. "This is ridiculous," her older sister Katie said, hands on her hips. "I tried to tell you that before you had the twins, but you thought trying for a girl one more time was a good idea." "You're the one stuck with 6 boys," Amber teased, pulling on her coat and smirking. "5 of whom can totally sleep on the floor of the family room," Katie replied. "We should all stay here, at Mom's house, together. I can't handle the guilt of kicking you out." Amber's oldest nephew, Chad, stared at his mom with wide eyes. "No, Mom. Don't make me sleep in the same room as Cam and Charlie. They'll play all night." Katie gritted her teeth. She glanced at Amber and whispered, "Teens," before turning back to her 15-year-old. "You'd make your aunt stay at a hotel so you don't have to sleep in a huge room with your brothers?" Her arched eyebrows, scarily reminiscent of their mother's, caused Chad to retreat a couple inches. "She wants to," he said, throwing his hands toward Amber. She bit down on her lips to keep from laughing. Since the day Chad was born, Katie had never really appreciated how funny her kids could be when they were disobedient. "You have to stay here," Kate said. "Otherwise my child will grow up to be spoiled and entitled." Amber held up her hands, barely keeping her shoulders from shaking. "Make him sleep there anyway and give the twins their own beds." She pulled on her hat. "The ranch house is literally just across the highway. Less than a mile, actually. And no one will be jumping in my bed at 5 a.m. Katie hurried over to the door and put her hands on Amber's shoulders. "I'll lock the twins in their room." "Cross my heart." "Katie." Amber mimicked her sister's stance, putting her hands on Katie's shoulders. "You're the mom. You can make Chad and the minions sleep in the family room even if there are beds available. No one will be entitled and spoiled, and I can eat Bellamy's biscuits and gravy every morning." "You're rubbing it in." "Maybe you should come too, Katie," Amber teased. "Then everyone can be spoiled and entitled. My husband will whine if I leave him here with the boys." Katie frowned and sighed. They both started laughing. "Fine." Katie stepped back, as though her nearness to Amber had been the only thing keeping Amber from going. "I'll see you tonight at the party." Amber leaned over. "Come over early. I have a dress you should wear that Will's gonna love." Katie snorted with laughter and pushed her sister toward the door. 6 boys, Amber. You don't own a dress that forgiving in the hips." Amber laughed in return, waved to her mom in the kitchen, and then headed out the door. According to Mom, there'd been snow in Little River the previous week, but it had all mostly melted, leaving crunchy patches around the yard and a few slicks of dark ice on the gravel road in front of the house. Her nephews were all hoping that the snowstorm that weekend would bring in piles of snow for Christmas. Amber didn't want to drive on those roads when she headed home to Fort Collins the following week. But as she hopped into her silver sedan, she smiled at the scenery around her. It wouldn't look so bad with some fluffy snow, and maybe extending her vacation wouldn't be the worst thing. As a teacher, she had a long holiday break along with her students. She'd planned to head home after New Year's to utilize the days off to do some deep cleaning at her house, but where was the fun in that? Bad roads would be a legitimate excuse to put that off. Bellamy hugged Amber when she arrived, laughing as Amber related the resistance she'd faced about not staying at her parents' house. As Amber talked, they went upstairs to one of the rooms. They'd gone to high school together in Little River but hadn't been particularly close, until they'd ended up on the same floor of the dorms their freshman year at University of Wyoming. They'd kept in touch since then, and Bellamy had been the one to suggest that Amber splurge and stay at the ranch house over Christmas. Bellamy left Amber to get ready for the famous Christmas party that the ranch house held every year on the day before Christmas Eve. Amber hadn't been to one before. Though she'd been in town the past few Christmases since the ranch house opened, she usually didn't get into town until too late in the evening to make it. She laid out the gray tulle midi skirt and billowing white blouse she'd brought to wear, making sure neither had wrinkles that needed attending to, then pulled out the sparkling, strappy silver heels she couldn't find enough excuses to wear on a regular basis. She'd bought the outfit the year before to go to Carson's office party, hoping not to stand out as the teacher among all the glamorous women who worked with him and the wives of the power members of the firm. When Amber found a jetted tub in the bathroom, she nearly decided to forego the party and just spend the evening in her room. She spent so long soaking in the wondrous thing, and going back and forth about the party, that she could hear the murmur of guests downstairs getting louder and louder by the time she finished her hair. She stepped out of her room the same time the door across the hall opened. Amber couldn't help it. She froze. Dru North. Dru freaking North was standing in the hallway staring right back at her. His long, ashy blonde hair had been pulled into a neat bun on top of his head, a style Amber always made fun of when she and her friends talked about the hipster wannabes at the gym, but she secretly really liked. His beard was trimmed, close to his face and much shorter than the last picture she'd seen of him when it had been long and maybe a little bit scraggly. Not that Dru North, his eyes so green that Amber could not take her own away, was ever scraggly. But she definitely liked this. He was wearing a suit, dark blue with a gray shirt and white tie, and he looked like a slick businessman. Or a model. Probably just a model. Whatever he looked like, it wasn't the dress-down, t-shirt and jeans country star who was usually plastered all over the media. "Hi," she finally said. "Hi." He held out a hand. "I'm Dru." She took it, risking that he might feel the way her fingers were shaking. "Amber." He pulled his hand from hers slowly. "Can I walk you down?" he asked, gesturing toward the stairs. "Okay." Not only was Dru North staying across the hall from her, but she was going to walk into the ranch house Christmas party with him. She gripped the clutch that held her phone and lip gloss, and nodded. "Sure." He slipped a hand on her back as they moved that direction, and Amber had to focus so she wouldn't trip. "You in town for this famous party?" he asked. Bellamy tried to talk it down, but I'm sure all those high rollers this place caters to probably fly in specially. He gestured to the white lights twined along the railing within a white garland, like those kinds of decorations were too tempting for a famous actress or musician to pass up. Wait, did he think she was one of those high rollers? She sort of hated to disappoint him. "Not quite. I'm here to visit family. Grew up in Little River, actually." "But what about you? Did you fly in just for this party?" Amber almost grinned in triumph that she'd managed to tease him, what with all the concentrating on not making a dummy out of herself. "Tag, you know Tag? I know this is a small town, but I'm never sure if you all call him Tag or Taggart or what." He turned and grinned at her, and she had to take a slow and sneaky breath in. "I knew him as Tag growing up. He's a little older than me, so it's not like we're really close, but we went to a small high school, so you know everyone." She shrugged like she didn't drop the fact all the time in Fort Collins that she'd gone to high school with Taggart Du Bois. "He invited me out," Dru finished. "It sounded nice. How come you're not staying with your family?" He glanced over her, eyes trailing down her like he was actually checking her out, although there was a hint of confusion to his gaze. In any case, she was going to add to the list of facts she dropped. "Dru North checked me out at a party. My mom's house was a little full. My older sister has 6 boys and she cut herself off. He didn't need to know all the particulars. It was crowded." He chuckled. "I understand that. Tag promised me peace and quiet for a couple weeks." "You have 6 boys?" she tossed back. She was actually on a roll here, conversing with him like a normal person and everything. His laugh was deep and husky and sent a shiver fully up her spine. No. Sometimes it feels that way with all the time I have to spend with my band and manager and everyone." "I bet." They'd made it down the stairs, and Amber glanced at the people there, noticing that several eyes were on them, most notably her sister Katie's. She was standing inside the door, handing her coat over to one of the kids from town who must have been hired to help. Her eyes widened, and her mouth formed an O, as she openly stared. Amber scowled at her, mentally sending a message that she get a grip. "There's my sister," so Amber took a step away. Dru caught her arm and leaned over. You're not going to abandon me, are you? I don't see Tag and Roxy, and I don't know anyone here. He said the words lightly, but when she turned to look at him, she noticed a bit of panic there. He probably usually had people to handle, well, all the people he had to deal with that weren't always professional in their interactions. She wondered what Tag and Roxy had been thinking, leaving him here by himself to fend off fans at a party. Of course not. She smiled. Come and meet my sister and her husband. Thanks, Dru breathed, his breath tickling her neck before he straightened. Amber nearly fell flat on her face. Was this some sort of Christmas magic happening? Whatever, she'd take it. Her sister hugged her like they hadn't just seen each other an hour before and whispered, "What the?" before she pulled away. You know Dru North, Katie? Amber held her hand out to gesture to him. He's staying across the hall from me. Dru, this is my sister, Katie, and her husband, Will. Dru reached over and shook their hands, everyone murmuring greetings. Will kept squinting at Dru like he was trying to place him. Amber barely held back laughter at it. Her brother-in-law knew far more sports-related names than entertainment ones. Let's go get food, Katie said. I've been waiting all year for this. She took Will's hand and headed across the open living area to the dining room, where the long table there was piled with the food Bellamy had probably been slaving over all day. Dru tilted his head and stared after Katie's retreating back before sharing a confused look with Amber. Have you heard of Bellamy's famous cooking? Amber asked. Of course. Roxy brought her out once to cater a dinner party Tag threw. I thought it was overkill until I started eating. He patted his stomach and nodded appreciatively. Amber laughed. Katie's a big fan too. They found Tag and Roxy next to the food table, where Bellamy was hovering as well. Bellamy's attention snapped to Amber as soon as she arrived at Dru's side, but Bellamy didn't say anything until she skirted around the table and Dru had moved away to talk to Tag. What is this? She whispered. Ditto, Katie said, stepping up on Amber's other side. What's what? Amber asked in a low voice, glancing at Dru to make sure he wasn't paying attention. Oh, but he was. He met her gaze and grinned, making her cheeks heat at getting caught looking at him. As if she hadn't done enough ogling upstairs. We met as we were coming out of our rooms. He offered to walk me downstairs, and since he didn't know anyone, he stuck around. He keeps looking at you like it's definitely more than you met upstairs, Katie said. Wishful thinking, Amber said warningly. He probably just wants some girl to flirt with to keep him entertained while he's here. Bellamy pointed at her, and since they were standing so close, her finger nearly nicked Amber's nose. Don't judge a book by its cover, Amber. Even if that cover is crazy hot. She chuckled but then turned serious again. Tag has told me a lot about him. He's different than how they portray him online. Amber still shook her head. Even if he's ready for 6 boys and a pretty house with a yard, he's too rich for this humble girl. She'd had enough of trying to keep up during the years she'd dated Carson. Katie pressed her lips together, then gave a little huff and a before reaching for one of Bellamy's homemade Oreos. You have your fill? Will's voice interrupted their conversation as he came to stand behind Katie, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Katie turned to face him, staring up at her husband with a mischievous smile. Is that really possible when it comes to Bellamy's food? Take a break to dance, he asked. Katie's eyebrows jumped. You want to dance? Amber followed her sister's gaze to the middle of the living area. The usual furniture of the ranch house main room had been pushed back to the walls to accommodate a handful of couples swaying to the music. Will took Katie's hand and twirled her around, then rolled her back into his arms. Dance with me? Will. Katie gasped in delight, letting her husband lead her to the floor. Bellamy shook her head from beside Amber, both of them staring after the couple with envious smiles. Is that actually Will Sutton, dancing? Amber gently bumped Bellamy's shoulder. I want a Will Sutton of my own someday. Would a Dru North do for tonight? Amber jumped, startled, right along with Bellamy as they both turned to Amber's other side to see that Dru had joined them. Amber gave a breathy laugh. You're no Will, but I suppose you'll do. Dru grinned, his green eyes sparkling as he held out a hand to Amber and nodded toward the dance floor. Dance with me, he mimicked her brother-in-law. She took his hand without hesitation. Even if Dru reminded her a little too much of Carson at the moment, magic was in the air. It wouldn't hurt to flirt right back with this man. She needed a little entertainment herself. Chapter 3. Amber was definitely Dru's type. He had always had a thing for blondes, and it seemed like she had 100 different shades of it in the waves that floated around her shoulders and dropped to the middle of her back. More than a few of the actresses, models, and other musicians that Dru had dated the last few years had been blondes. Amber was petite, barely reaching his shoulder in the 4-inch heels she wore. Tag had promised him a peaceful vacation, but this woman had shattered that just by stepping out of her room. He couldn't put his finger exactly on what it had been, but there had been a pull from the beginning. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about her. The way she was a little bit starstruck but still teased him. The little glances she kept giving him. How she kept pressing her lips together and drawing his attention there. Her fingers had grazed lightly over the words of one of his tattoos that edged just past his wrist, but when he'd looked down to see her studying it, she'd blushed and looked away. She was in town to visit her family, but Dru had to figure out how to see her again and get to know her. In the meantime, he'd better take advantage of whatever time he had with her tonight. "Have you been to this party before?" he asked once he'd slipped his arm around her back. His fingers slid perfectly to her opposite hip, holding her a little too close for someone he'd only met less than a half an hour before, but she didn't move away. She leaned into him as she swayed and gave a little sigh. Adorable. No. This is only the 4th year, and I usually get to town too late to come. Katie and will come all the time. And my parents, but I haven't seen them yet. She frowned slightly as she scanned the room and then shrugged, looking back to him. What do you think? The food is killer, of course. The company is pretty great too. He held her gaze, his smile growing as she held her breath for a brief second. You're a flirt. I am. Is that okay? He tilted his head, hoping she felt the buzz of electricity between them. She laughed, the same full of air, sweet sound she'd tossed his way when he'd asked her to dance. Oh yes. So, what do you do when you're not dancing with handsome country music stars at intimate Christmas parties? He asked. Teacher. 6th grade. That seems quite brave. I'm not sure what to think of most of the 6th graders I know. His honorary little sister, Sheenia, had been almost 14 when he met her, and life had dealt enough tragedy to her that she was far too mature for her age. Amber nudged him gently. You know a lot of 6th graders? Hadley Vega is 13. Does she count? The child country prodigy who plays the fiddle like she sold her soul? Amber squinted at him, but her eyes held a spark of mischief more than anything else. That's the one. Doesn't count. A kid that talented? She must have mad discipline skills. Which makes her unlike at least 60% of the kids in my class. She gave him a mock grimace. She is fairly amazing. Still trying to convince her mom to let me tour with her. Last time they'd done late-night country together, Hadley's mom had been flirting with him like crazy. He'd flirted back, hoping to butter her up to his manager's attempts to get Hadley scheduled on at least a few concert dates with him. Maybe that was the problem. Amber gave a soft snort of laughter. I bet it's the hair. Little too grungy pop star who might corrupt her daughter? There she went with that teasing again. He loved it. He slipped his hand out of hers just long enough to dust fake dirt off his shoulder. His suit was Brioni and designed for him. Grungy? She fanned her face. Oh boy. Then she whistled softly. Oh boy. Yeah, he agreed. Was it the twinkling lights strung around nearly everything? The tiny tin buckets filled with candles and the little Christmas trees that dotted every surface? Something about this night made him sure he was falling quickly for Amber, though it was crazy to think so. Christmas had always made Dru lighthearted and ready to believe in magic. The song passed quicker than Dru realized, both of them bantering about everything from favorite Christmas breakfast foods. He scoffed at her Fruit Loops choice. She agreed pancakes, when homemade, were wonderful, to their families. They danced the next one too, and the next. They danced until Dru noticed a fire through the large picture windows that looked out onto the wide back porch. "There's a fire out there," he asked, slowing their swaying so he could stare at it. "In the fire pit on the porch." She nodded, resting her head absently on his shoulder as she stared too. "Isn't it kind of cold for that?" "It's a fire," she straightened, giving him a smirk. "Besides, it was like nearly 35 today. Practically spring." He shivered. "That's disturbing." "Come on." She tugged on the hand she'd been holding while they danced, tilting her head toward the French-style doors that led onto the porch. "Let's see how tough Dru North really is." He didn't resist. The night air surprised him when he stepped out, though he couldn't explain why. Like he had expected the warmth from inside to somehow just follow him around. He didn't show it, though. Amber kept turning around to look at him as they made their way toward the fire, smiling like she thought he might turn into an ice cube right in front of her. Considering she still held his hand and warmth was radiating up his arm from her touch, turning to ice wasn't really possible. A few steps more and they stood next to the crackling fire in the pit, the cold air mostly chased away. Amber leaned into him as they stood there, staring into the flames. The only other people who had braved the porch smiled at them as they passed by to go back inside. "Okay, definitely tough as they say," she said softly. "I have that tattooed on my bicep somewhere." She laughed. The way her laughter sometimes escaped her, like it was a surprise, tickled his insides with more warmth. It could be 0 degrees out here, and he could stand next to her and not feel it. He glanced back at the window, catching a few people watching them, and shifted into the darkness on the other side of the fire. He glanced around them. "What is it?" she asked in a whisper. He looked down at her, turning so that he faced her, blocking them both from anyone determined to find them. "Looking for mistletoe," he teased. She put her warm hands on the sides of his neck, then slid her fingers up into the short hairs there. Not really necessary." He tilted his head down toward her, stilling as he neared her lips. He just met this woman an hour before, but the pull to her was magnetic. He couldn't avoid it if he tried. She didn't even give him time to think about it before she leaned into him, finishing off the distance between them and pressing her lips to his. The fire behind them seemed to jump from the pit and explode around him. He wrapped his arms around her back, shifting her backward to lean against the side of the house. Her fingers slid up farther, pulling his head down to her. He let the magic of the night take over for several seconds, or maybe minutes, while he kissed her. She pulled away and stared at him, her fingers slowly trailing back down the back of his neck, gripping his shoulders. That was... wow. He drew in a long breath, loosening his arms around her, but not enough to let her go. "Not yet." "Yeah, I don't think I should have done that." Her voice trembled with a light laugh. "A fake one. Because you hardly know me? You're Dru North." She blew out a breath. Usually the insinuation didn't bother him. The women he'd dated in the past had figured out quickly enough what was hype and what was him. And there was a lot of hype. But he tensed anyway. He liked Amber. Really liked her, and it hurt to be judged so quickly. Then he shook it off, deciding that was unfair. She'd known him all of an hour or so. Enough time for him to be charming. Not enough time for her to separate an image from the real guy. "You're Amber," he started to tease and then broke off when he realized he didn't know her last name. Classy, North. If there was ever a reason to believe that he was the womanizing bad boy, he'd just given it to her. "Miller," she supplied. She gave him a see what I mean look. He would not have tried to convince her to go upstairs with him, no matter how long they'd spent together tonight, but that's not what his image said. He'd just have to show her. "I want to get to know you," he said, taking her hands in his and kissing her knuckles. She relaxed a little. "This is crazy," she whispered. He spread her fingers out in his and then began kissing the tips. Please. I'm only here for 10 days. Plenty of time. Let me prove to you who I am. She tapped her fingers against his chest, watching him as she considered. Okay. But you can't do that again. He raised his eyebrows in question. Kissing me. It messes with my head. That's an unacceptable deal. It doesn't have to be on the first date, but I am going to need to kiss you again. He loosened his arms some more, making sure she understood she could walk away at any moment. She was irresistible, but he was standing out here in the cold, in the dark, purposefully out of view of the other guests at the party. He didn't want to scare her. 12 dates, she said. Dru scowled. What? You can kiss me again after 12 dates. She punctuated this by sliding her hands inside his jacket, her hands cold against his chest. You're only here 10 days. She pulled up one shoulder, mock grimacing at him. Well, either you'll rise to the challenge or you won't. And with that she slipped out of his grasp and back into the house. When Dru got back inside, Amber was already across the room, at the front door, greeting an older couple, probably her parents. Luckily, he caught sight of her sister, Katie, still standing next to the food. She was devouring what looked like a homemade slice of French bread slathered in a cream cheese and butter mixture he'd noted earlier. Dru caught Bellamy's arm as he passed her, and led her, startled, to where Katie stood. I need your help, he said to both. Katie stared at him in horror, holding a napkin up over her mouth. Bellamy snorted softly and then covered the laughter. She turned to Dru. Help with what? Dating Amber for the 10 days she's here in town. Katie's eyes widened further, but she was still trying to swallow the bread, preventing her from saying anything. Bellamy spoke for them again. I can believe that the media has made you out to be someone you're not, but I'm not sure I can believe you're not capable of wooing a woman on your own. She says I have 12 dates to prove it. 10 days and Christmas in there? I'm going to need help. Dru rubbed the back of his head. Just a little spying and reporting. That's all I ask. He held up prayer hands to them both. Katie nodded eagerly. Bellamy squinted at him and then shrugged. Okay. Sure. Chapter 4. Amber had caught herself grinning in the mirror at least a dozen times that morning. Funny how her lips didn't show that she had been given the most electric, most amazing kiss of her life, but she felt it. Felt it in the butterflies that had swirled through her stomach and the fear that had jolted her that Dru might just be flirting. It's okay, if he is, she said to herself. A holiday fling would be fun. A holiday fling with Dru North was something to name drop about for years and years. When she was an old woman, telling her granddaughters stories, she'd put on a song of his, maybe written about her, if she was lucky, and tell them all about that magical Christmas vacation when she briefly dated a rock star. Country rock star. And maybe it would just be that one kiss. Still. The impulsiveness of the evening before made her giddy with excitement. She had dated a lot of guys in college, and she could remember a few times when she'd met someone at a party and felt the click or kissed one on a first date. But she'd been with Carson for 5 years, and the fun, impulsive girl felt like a long time ago. Graduating college, settling down as a teacher, having a long, committed relationship, that long ago. Even if all this turned out to be was one night or a handful of moments where they flirted, she'd take it. It sounded fun, and she hadn't had enough of that in her life, even before breaking up with Carson. She picked up her phone and turned on the Dru North Love Songs playlist she'd created the night before and smiled again. She was singing along to Careful with That Heart, one of the only really tender ones he'd recorded, when there was a knock on the door. She frowned at the mirror. It was only 9 a.m., but maybe Mom had convinced Katie to come over and chill with Amber for a little while. She hurried through the bedroom to open the door. And when it was Dru standing outside, grinning at her, she was glad that she'd pretty much finished getting ready. Good morning, he offered. Good gracious, he had a smile. All straight teeth, of course, but creases around the cheeks that made him look really happy. And his green eyes were something to sing about. Had any women of country music written about those eyes yet? There was a rumor that he and Courtney Blaze had an on-again, off-again, tumultuous relationship. Amber was going to have to investigate her songs. Hi. She blinked at Dru, those butterflies swooping around again and heat racing to her cheeks, and she remembered all the silly things she daydreamed about as she lay in bed the night before and replayed that kiss and then thought about what if. So you like this song? He asked. Her cheeks burned as she remembered what was playing. Play it cool. She gave a laugh, too full of air, of course, but she tried not to let it get to her. One of your best. Agreed. My sister wrote that song. And if it was possible, his smile turned like 1,000 times sexier. I love that. She leaned against the doorframe and stared at him. She might slam the door in his face if she didn't anchor herself to the moment, because he was making not falling into his arms very difficult. Have you had breakfast yet? He asked. She shook her head. She'd danced with him forever last night. Kissed the man. And then convinced both of them not to be too crazy about this whole thing, and yet she couldn't really put together a decent conversation with him now. Apparently, the 10 or so hours apart had ruined being used to the fact that he was smiling at her like that. He had on a dark green thermal Henley that hugged his broad shoulders so well and a scarf. Oh heavens, a scarf. If it wasn't so hot, she'd giggle about it. Would you like to have breakfast with me? He asked. She nodded, then added, can you give me a second? I'm not quite ready. He looked surprised. Really? Man, you're gorgeous. I didn't even think. And only the fact that he trailed off and there was actually pink in his cheeks clued her into the fact that he hadn't meant to let any of that out and it wasn't a line. Her heart thumped hard. Just lip gloss, she breathed. 12 dates. 12 dates. It was going to be hard to resist him if he tried to kiss her sooner. He could have leaned in right there and stolen one, but he stayed just outside the door. Not even asking to come in. She left it open as she hurried back to the bathroom, using the momentary privacy to take a deep breath. Before Carson, she'd known guys who would have slipped into her room and ignored her request not to push this further, if they could tell she didn't exactly want to follow it herself. Dru was getting major points for the fact that he was still outside her door. She peeked around the doorway just to be positive. Maybe she had rushed things the night before, insisting that they get to know each other a little before they took another step forward. He watched her when she came out and locked the room door behind her, and his gaze made her so aware of him that she thought she might break into a sweat. Then he offered her his hand as they stood in the hall together, and the slight raise of his eyebrows asked, "Is this okay?" She took it. He had long fingers that held hers gently. She brushed against the calluses on the ends of his fingers and found herself thinking of him playing the guitar and singing just for her. Tag had posted a video on Instagram the other day, singing Christmas songs to Roxy, and Amber had melted along with everyone else in the country, more still because she'd actually been witness to some of the times he'd done that same thing in high school. The dining room was empty when they came in, but as though she had some sixth sense, Bellamy appeared from the kitchen. Breakfast, she asked, and Amber had to give her credit that her eyes did not stray in the least toward their hands. What do you guys want? What do we have this morning? Dru asked, dropping Amber's hand to hold out a chair for her at the long dining room table. Depending on how long you want to wait, I have pretty much everything. Bellamy winked at them. But there's biscuits that are still warm, and I can whip up eggs and bacon pretty quickly too. Any leftovers from last night are instant. Dru leaned over the chair Amber had just sat down in. Are you a cookies for breakfast girl? He asked in a mock whisper. When it's not Bellamy cooking, always, Amber whispered back. She's right. I'll take the eggs, bacon, and biscuits. Dru dropped into the chair next to her. Same. Amber nodded, meeting Bellamy's eyes. Her friend's grin widened the tiniest bit before she disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving Amber alone with Dru. He turned in his chair to face her. It's good to see you again. She couldn't help a laugh, even if her chest warmed at the sweet sentiment. It's only been since last night. It seemed like a long night since I spent it trying to figure out how to get 12 dates in as little as time possible. He rested his elbows on the table and leaned toward her. It pulled his sleeve down and revealed several lines of writing going down the front of his forearm. She ran her fingers over it and then looked up at him. Carson had been all buttoned up and professional. The myriad of patterns and lettering on Dru's arm intrigued her, and she'd love to just sit and study them and find out why he'd gotten each and every one. She'd really just like to sit and get to know everything about him. She started to pull away, but he caught her fingers with his other hand and held them there, then let them go and pushed up his sleeve. You're welcome to inspect them all you want. His voice held a touch of huskiness that made Amber's breath hitch. Had he read her mind, or was he thinking all the same things she was, how to cram a month or two of dates into just over a week? She played it off, taking his arm in hers so she could look at the writing closer. It was a sloping script, reminding her of old-time writing fonts she'd seen when searching for signs and art for her classroom. It took her several minutes to make out the words and then she grinned. Is this a Taylor Swift song? She asked. He returned the smile, lips wide and eyes sparkling. Yes. That one is for Raneé, my sister. Amber tilted her head at him. She wanted to trust the sweetness behind those words, but Dru had a reputation. Sister sounded better than ex-girlfriend. You're just saying that. His smile wavered, making her feel bad. But she hadn't been the one who dated every female country star that crossed his path or to party so hard he had to pay steep prices to hotels to cover room destruction. It's from Never Grow Up. He softly sang the protective lyrics printed on his arm to her, then smirked. Cross my heart. It was for Raneé. He gave a sigh. Honestly, I was kind of indifferent to tattoos before all this. This was my first one, he pointed to the words. But the rest have mostly been about cultivating an image. I see. And dating all the actresses and models and musicians, she teased. She liked that he had a cheesy Taylor Swift song for his sister tattooed on his arm, liked it too much, and if she didn't create some sort of joke right now, she wasn't going to last another 12 minutes, let alone 12 dates. He ran a finger gently over her cheek to tuck back a strand of hair she pulled out of the ponytail she'd fixed at the nape of her neck. She'd wanted to keep her day low-key and easy, and she hadn't planned on having breakfast with Dru. Some of them, maybe, he said in a low voice. His face was so close to hers, but he didn't make any move to close that distance. Amber wouldn't do anything to stop him. The memory of the kiss the night before tingled across her lips. But you shouldn't believe every picture you see online, even if you think you know the story. Amber swallowed. Then maybe I take back what I said last night. What's a holiday romance without a few stolen kisses under the mistletoe? She raised her eyes skyward to the exposed beams and the bunch of mistletoe above them, twined with twinkling white lights. Dru sat up. That's not what I want. Disappointment stole through her, but she reminded herself of her pep talk up in her room. She'd already kissed him, danced with him, now had breakfast with him. Then he smirked as the sound of the kitchen doors opening alerted them to Bellamy coming back. I want a lot more than just a holiday romance, honey. Chapter 5. Dru waved to Amber from the couch in the living room when she left after breakfast to spend the rest of the day with her family. It was Christmas Eve after all, and she said her sister had been texting all morning, guilting her for not coming over to hang out. He didn't wallow in too much disappointment. Katie had promised to help Dru too, so he was hopeful Amber's sister would find a way to include him in the day's plans. He tried to feel guilty about imposing on her family time, but they'd known her all her life. Dru hadn't even gotten a full day yet. And the way she talked about her family had him hoping to be included, and not just for more time with Amber. Playing games, watching silly movies, eating holiday food, it was all the kind of thing he'd been trying to get his family to do for years. But his father and stepmom had always kept Christmases simple. Exchanging gifts, maybe a nice dinner. He was close enough to Brienne and Manny, Sheenie's adoptive parents, that he had an open invitation to holidays there. They usually had other teens staying with them, so they often didn't include the joy of little children that Amber had described. Bellamy had told Dru that the other guests staying at the ranch house for the holiday had scattered about town, busying themselves with the tourist attractions available to avid Taggart Du Bois fans and the many charming, small-town amenities that Little River offered. She'd given him a list of suggestions for the following week so he could ask Amber out on official dates once Christmas was over. In any case, right now he had the main living area of the house all to himself. He could hear Bellamy in the kitchen, prepping for the big Christmas Eve dinner the house would host for any guests who wanted to stay and for Bellamy's and Roxy's families. He was trying to read a novel that Roxy had recommended, but the smell of pies kept distracting him. He finally set the book aside and headed for the kitchen. Bellamy turned when he walked in. "I thought you would have snuck off to the Millers by now with some big idea for your second date of the day." He chuckled. "Waiting for Katie to text me with the opening. In the meantime, can I help?" She furrowed a brow. "I try not to recruit the guests as slave labor. It's kind of poor business if your Yelp review includes that we offer dish duty as entertainment. I was thinking more along the lines of letting me make pie." Now Bellamy's brows jumped. "If you need references, you can call Tag. He blames me for the 10 pounds he gained on our last tour together." She pulled her hands from the bowl they'd been elbow deep in, revealing that she was kneading dinner rolls. "Pie is an important thing at this dinner, Dru. Can I trust you with that responsibility?" "You can trust him, Belle." Roxy's voice came from behind him. "I'm sorry to have to tell you, my very dearest friend, that the best cherry pie I have ever in my life eaten was made by this man." Bellamy nodded gravely, almost making Dru crack up. "I do trust that Roxy would never blaspheme my cooking like that, so pie duty goes to you." Dru rubbed his hands together and headed for the pantry, where he could see a spare apron hanging on a hook on the door. He pulled it on, ignoring that Tag came in behind his wife and laughed at the tiny pink polka dots and the ruffled pockets that decorated the apron. "What happens to me if I snap a picture and post it to Instagram and ruin that whole rowdy frat boy image you have going on?" Bellamy asked. "His manager will ruin you," Tag said. "He made me take down a tweet a couple weeks ago because I mentioned Dru destroyed me in a cookie-making contest." Bellamy grimaced but snapped a picture anyway. "Okay, for my own personal pleasure. And maybe a few friends," she gave Dru a knowing look. He answered it with a go-right-ahead slow blink. Roxy got to work with them, and an hour later they were joined by Bellamy's mother. Tag disappeared, but Dru could hear him strumming in the dining room. Roxy would sing along softly every once in a while, even to songs that Dru didn't recognize. It made him hopeful for something like that someday, where he could share his creativity, pies or songs, with someone who got him. He was just finishing up the pumpkin pies when his phone buzzed. He pulled his phone out to see a message from Katie. "Taking the boys to the Christmas Eve matinee. Leaving in half an hour." He pulled off the apron. "Mind if I ditch? The pumpkin ones just need to be baked." "Got a hot date?" Bellamy asked, waving him out of the kitchen. "Hope so," he called as he left. Approximately 2 hours in a dark theater with Amber, and 2 dates down in one day. He was off to an excellent start. When Katie led Dru into the living room at Amber's parents' house, Amber blinked up at him the same way she had earlier that morning when he'd showed up at her door asking to take her to breakfast. "Dru?" She stood up from where she'd been sitting on top of a lanky teenager who was sprawled, face down in the couch. "I'm saved," the boy cried, hopping up. Amber rolled her eyes. He stood at least 4 inches taller than her, and Dru had a feeling he could have bucked his aunt off if he'd really tried. "I heard they play a Christmas Eve matinee around here. I wondered if you wanted to go with me?" He stuffed his hands in his pockets and waited for her answer. Katie had seemed sure that Amber would definitely welcome his company, but he was horning in on family holiday time. "I'm trying to convince myself that you're a mind reader and not a stalker," Amber gave a fake grimace. Dru strode closer. "Katie," he whispered in explanation. "Oh." But she furrowed her eyebrows at him instead of smiling at his antics, like she had before. Had he gone too far with this? She reached up and brushed something out of his beard. You have flour? He laughed, stroking the short hairs just in case she hadn't gotten it all. I've been making pies. Her shoulders shook with silent laughter. No. This is definitely a case of you making something up to try and contradict what you keep calling a reputation. She used her fingers to make air quotes around the word. He put his hands on her shoulders, resisting, for a moment, the urge to just wrap her up in his arms. He would later. She'd said he couldn't kiss her again. No mention of hugging or cuddling had been a part of that. You can confirm with Bellamy. Trust me, Amber, pretty much nothing you read about me on the internet is actually true. He fixed her with a serious stare. He needed her to understand that. Wrecking Remington Cole's boat on a fishing trip because you were drunk. He forced himself to keep a straight face. Rem wrecked it because he'd never driven a boat before in his life, and he didn't tell any of us that. I wasn't drunk, neither was Rem, but I can't speak for the other 4 people on the boat. No one had been hurt, so they hadn't let Rem live that down. Dru still had a hard time not laughing whenever he thought about the panic on Rem's face when he'd pushed too hard on the throttle and turned too sharply, driving the boat right into the old dock behind his house on the Gulf. But it feeds into an image, so we didn't correct any of the assumptions. It wouldn't have mattered if we did. People will think what they want to think now. She questioned. My manager and publicity team. So this movie date? He gave her a pleading look. The amusement returned to her face. Can you handle a movie with 4-year-old twins and a teenager who's likely to make fun of every possible thing? If I say yes, can I come? Chapter 6. The Little River Cinema was relatively empty, but all 20 of the people, besides the crowd that Amber had arrived with, had snuck furtive glances in Dru's direction before the lights had been turned down to start the movie. He waved and smiled at those who kept his gaze long enough and had even signed a few autographs, for a couple women brave enough to come and ask. But once the previews had started and the 2 little boys, between her and Katie, were staring at the big screen, Amber turned her attention to her date. She had precious few minutes before her 4-year-old nephews lost interest in the movie. Even though they professed to love everything Star Wars, she doubted the show would keep them entertained the entire 2.5 hours. There's something I've been dying to ask you, she said to Dru in a low voice. He had slipped his arm around the back of her seat the moment the lights turned down, so he leaned his head closer to hers. No, I haven't ever actually destroyed a hotel room either. Okay. I believe you. Promise. Mostly. She believed that he hadn't done a lot of the stupid stuff the press attributed to him. And he did bake pie. And had tattooed sweet Taylor Swift lyrics for his sister on his arm. But he'd also dated a lot of women, and if only half of them were for his image, that still left a lot of women. Plus he threw around money the same way Carson had, worse, because he had so much more. She'd picked up on the amusement in his expression when they talked about the boat incident even though he'd tried to hide it. The damage they must have done, and she could tell he hardly thought of it. Of how much it must have cost Remington Cole to repair it all. His eyes narrowed, like he read that behind her expression. In the dim light she doubted he could see her blush, so she dismissed it. She couldn't change her ideas about the gorgeous man sitting next to her, dropped into her life by pure accident and then insisting that fate had led them together. Was he too sweet to really be true? Carson had been the king of romance, but he'd done so from afar for nearly 5 years. That hadn't been enough for Amber. Is your real name Dru North? She asked. Tag used a stage name, but she didn't know if that was true of all musicians. And Dru North just seemed so, well, like a stage name. My real name is Andrew. I've gone by that most of my life, but my family has called me Dru since I was little. His expression relaxed at the question. I've always really liked unique spellings, she mulled. I tried to convince Katie with every one of her boys to try something cool. Will always said no. Dru shook his head. Sorry to disappoint you, but it's Andrew, like normal. My manager just thought Dru looked edgier than Drew. She tilted her head at him, imagining changing so much about herself, her life, how people saw her, so she could be successful. Would she do it? You've changed so much for this life, she murmured. He nodded, giving a sigh. I know. But it's always been my dream, and really, I haven't changed anything that matters. I know who I am. The people who love me know who I am. He left the rest unspoken, but Amber guessed it from the seriousness of his gaze. The woman who loves me will know who I am. She turned her attention to the screen, settling into Dru's arms for the few minutes they had uninterrupted by the twins' questions. He moved his arm to wrap around her shoulder, no longer the casual touch of resting it just behind her chair, and for a brief moment she felt his lips softly in her hair. She leaned into him, enjoying the intimacy before breaking it with her joke. So, I take it you wouldn't ruin all my plans for unique spellings? He laughed. I promise. Colby had lasted about 20 minutes before he was up in Dru's lap, asking him question after question and relating every bit of Star Wars minutiae he knew. Amber was finding it hard to concentrate on the movie and not just gaze at the way Dru laughed with Colby, and how he kept calling him Cade. The first few had been legitimate mistakes, but she was pretty sure at this point it was to entertain the more boisterous of the twins. Not that Dru would be able to tell them apart once they were side by side again. Amber could barely do it herself. Another 10 minutes and Cade had crawled into Amber's lap, but only to get closer to Colby and Dru. He was kneeling on her thigh, head deep in Dru's personal space as he helped Colby relate, in scene-by-scene detail, the last Star Wars movie they'd seen. Are your nephews and nieces like this? She asked in one of the rare lulls in the boys' descriptions. I'm an only child, Dru said. Colby physically turned Dru's head back toward him before she could question him about the sister he'd told her about. Do you need a code word for me to intervene? She pulled Cade down into her lap, making her nephew giggle as she snuggled him up against her. Think I can't handle a couple rowdy boys? I hang out with bigger versions way too often. He turned away from Amber before she gave him an answer, whispering something in Colby's ear. Yes. Yes, he cried. He put a finger to his lips, grimacing at the looks those around them had given. Amber bet they regretted sitting close to Dru North about 2 minutes in. We better ask Aunt Amber, he said. Colby cupped his cute hands around his lips and leaned toward Amber, his voice not low at all as he tried to whisper, Can we go to Miss Addie's diner and get hot chocolate? Amber only just kept from giggling. She turned to glance down the row, past Chad and Cam, to her sister. She raised her eyebrows in question, and Katie gave a thumbs up. Can I come? 7-year-old Charlie had appeared at her knees to give Amber wide eyes. She glanced at Dru, who gave a nod. Of course. She pulled him into her lap too, even though he didn't really fit there with Cade still wiggling around. Can I come too, Auntie? 9-year-old Cam poked his head between Chad and Amber from the row behind. How had he gotten there? How did Katie not lose a kid a day? Amber hadn't even noticed movement. Granted, the theater was dim, but still. Down the row, Katie leaned over and shook her head. Someone has to stay here with me, she said brightly, clearly trying to convince Cam it would be more fun to stay back with the older kids. We'll go help, Chad whispered, looking down the row to 13-year-old Cash. Cash frowned at first and then moved to get up. Katie shook her head. Boys. Are you guys serious? A man in the row in front them turned around. Just because he's with you, he jerked a thumb in Dru's direction. Doesn't mean you can disrupt the whole theater. I haven't seen this movie yet. Dru's eyes widened. Sorry, he offered. The man spun back around without responding. Katie, Dru, and Amber all shared looks. Will had his face in his hands, shoulders shaking. This is what happens when you have 6 kids, he whispered to Katie. She slapped his shoulder. Sutton boys, Amber said in a whisper. She waved them all out, crouching as she exited the row, leading everyone along. Katie followed them all out to the lobby. You guys don't have to take them all. Dru hoisted Colby onto his shoulders. I don't think that guy is going to allow any of them back in. He might not even let you go back in. Grinning, Amber gently pushed her sister back toward the theater. Go. Have a date with your husband. Enjoy what it's like to be in a theater without your 6 kids and cranky men yelling at you. Katie sighed and chuckled. Chad can babysit now. We've done that a lot. It's fine, Mom, Chad said, lifting Kate up the way Dru had. It made Amber wonder how long it would be until Chad tried to convince Katie to let him grow his hair out. Go make out. That will probably annoy that guy even more. Katie reached up to give her son a one-armed hug that he couldn't get away from with Kate on his shoulders. That's my boy. She waved at the group and then, at the last minute, tossed the keys to her Suburban in Amber's direction. Without missing a beat, Dru pulled the keys to his rental car, an expensive sports car, from his. Katie's eyes widened. We could just walk down to the diner and meet you. Then I'd have to walk back up here to get the car. Dru gave her a look that pointed out the ridiculousness of her request. Okay. She nodded slowly and turned back to the theater. So, Dru said, turning to look at Amber. Let's go. She put her arms around Charlie and Cam. Let's go. Chapter 7. Dru bet that this was definitely not what Tag had in mind when he'd suggested a peaceful vacation in Little River. And yet, Dru was loving every minute of it, despite the chaos that 6 boys, 2 of whom were twins, created around them. Amber, Dru, Chad, and Cash had all taken one of the younger Sutton boys each, and they'd managed to get everyone hot chocolate and a few plates of fries without too much trouble. The twins were busily slurping up their hot chocolates, and he couldn't help watching the whole family. Even though Dru and Amber had each taken a twin as their responsibility, Chad was sitting between the 2 boys, gaze darting back and forth, meeting every need and giving his whole attention to them. The twins had given Dru a fair amount of worshipful gazes back at the theater, but it was nothing compared to the love shining out of their eyes for their big brother. The other 3 boys were keeping themselves entertained as well, giggling every few seconds over something from the corner of the big, round corner booth where they all sat. Dru thought this was possibly the best Christmas Eve he'd ever had, and as his gaze slid to Amber, warmth fluttered in his chest to think that because of her, he was sitting in a booth, living his dream. He found Amber watching him, tilting her head and then pink blooming in her creamy-colored cheeks when he caught her. He grinned back. What are you thinking about? He asked. He'd resisted kissing her this morning, a choice he'd regretted off and on through the day, but even more than before, he stood by his words. There was more than magic here. There was joy, and he wanted a part of it, not just for a few days either. You said you were an only child, she began. But I handled the 6 Suttons like a champ. He held out a victory fist bump to her, even though she sat across from him at the booth. She laughed and shook her head while she obliged the fist bump. Yes, you did. But I was thinking about how you told me you have a sister. You know, those song lyrics? She pointed to his arm, and he remembered having to convince her he hadn't done it for one of his girlfriends. I guess honorary is a better word for it, though I never remember to explain that to people. Despite only being in his life 4 years, Dru found it difficult to remember a time when Raneé hadn't been texting him random lyrics or sending him videos of new songs. Wish I could say experience got me through tonight, but I think it might just be luck. And Chad. Chad glanced up and nodded at Dru, holding out a fist to bump of his own, even while keeping his attention on the wild hand gestures Cade was using in his latest story. He scooted a mug slightly to the left just in time to miss the sweeping motion Cade made to go along with the explosion sound effects he made. So, how did she get to be your honorary sister? Amber rested her elbows on the table and leaned into her hands, her expression neutral, and Dru could guess at what was running through her mind. Maybe the pretend sister was part of his image too. My mom left when I was 10, and at the time, I was buddies with a foster kid. His foster mom, Brienne, pretty much took me in too. My mom hasn't been around hardly at all since she left. Raneé is one of Brienne's kids. I really clicked with her, thanks to music, when they first got her. I hope, that I maybe helped her adjust and figure out how much Brienne and Manny love her. They've adopted her now. He pulled out his phone and opened up his Photos app, showing a picture of him and Raneé, one of many selfies he had of them on his phone. Amber took the photo and stared. "Oh," she said softly. "Fostering. I've always thought that was really brave." Dru kept back a smile at her smitten expression. She believed him. "Brienne is one of the bravest women I know," he said. "She's taken on some tough kids and melted them right through. And had to deal with heartache when some kids just don't understand how much she loves them, no matter what." He gave a shrug. "I'm in awe." Amber's smile was so irresistible that Dru didn't know how long he could sit all the way across this table from her. "Same here." He picked up his hot cocoa mug, trying to distract himself from forcing the boys to all scoot around in their seats so he could move to a spot closer to her. "So it's just you and Katie?" Amber nodded. "I guess we were wild enough for my mom." "Then Christmas hasn't always been like this?" She snorted. "You mean big and loud and crazy." "And fun," he said. "Really fun so far." She beamed, glancing around the table at the boys before turning back to him. "It's still always been big and crazy. We have a lot of cousins too. We'll all get together tomorrow afternoon at my grandma's house. She still likes to make sure she gives everyone a little something. It sounds like something out of a movie." He stared at her, enjoying watching the delight of memories flit across her face. "Even cooler, to tell the truth." "What was your favorite Christmas gift growing up?" he asked. He dumped the remainder of his fries onto the plate next to the 4 Middle Sutton boys, who attacked it with heartfelt thank yous to Dru. "The year we got Bailey, our old beagle. I was really small, but I remember how she poked up her head and made the top of the gift box fall off. She died a few years ago." Amber gave a shrug, then forced a smile back on her face. "My parents still haven't gotten me another dog for Christmas," she joked. "How about you?" Dru had to search his mind. He'd spent Christmas with Brienne and Manny the first year they had Sheenia, but it ended up being a disaster. Sheenia's birth mom had somehow figured out where Brienne and Manny lived and had come over, demanding her daughter spend Christmas with her. Dru had ended up being the one to call the police when she wouldn't leave, and Sheenia hadn't spoken to him for several days after that. Memorable, yes, but not a favorite. With every second that ticked by while he tried to come up with a favorite present, Amber's face fell, filling up with disappointment for him. "So," Amber pressed her lips together. "Then I take it you don't do family Christmases like this a lot?" He fingered his napkin. Not for lack of trying on his part. He'd even offered to fly his parents home to Nashville to spend it with him, but they'd already booked their Christmas trip. For years he'd tried to come up with things to have a Christmas more like this, gathered around a table at a diner, laughing over hot chocolate and fries. "Not usually," he said. "I hardly ever hear from my mom, and my dad and Sophia are enjoying their retirement too much to slow down." He forced a laugh over that. He couldn't fault them their love of traveling the world, and his dad had scrimped and saved and planned to be able to do this, without any help from Dru, although he'd finally convinced them to let him give them a trip to Europe next summer. He just wished they could spend a few days around the holiday with him. It might be a small celebration, but they were still family. "Oh." A little frown darted across Amber's lips before she lifted her hot chocolate mug and sipped slowly. She took a deep breath. "How would you feel about spending Christmas with the Millers?" Dru tried not to let his triumph show in his expression, but by the small laugh Amber replied with, he guessed he hadn't succeeded. "Are you asking me on a date?" Pink blossomed in her cheeks again, and Dru couldn't help reaching across the table to brush his fingers across one and feel the heat there. She tilted her head slightly into his touch before pulling away and clearing her throat, scowling at Chad when he started laughing at her and making smooching sounds. "I am," she said with a determined set to her chin. "And is it worth missing Bellamy's Christmas breakfast?" he asked. Amber smirked. "I guess that depends on how much you actually like me." He leaned across the table and captured her hands in his. "I like you a lot." When Will and Katie arrived, Dru offered to give Amber a ride back to the ranch house. He bet after an afternoon herding her nephews, she could use a nap. But she shook her head. I promised the boys I'd sleep in the family room with them tonight and try to catch Santa, she said. But she'd slipped her hand in his as they walked down the sidewalk towards where Katie and Will had parked his car behind their Suburban. Dru flicked his gaze to the Suburban, which the family was all piling into. Sounds like you're making things challenging for your sister. For Will. Amber paused next to Dru's car. It's a game that the older boys have been trying to beat him at since they figured out Santa wasn't real. But Will takes his job very seriously, and they begged me to help nab him this year. Dru thought the jealousy for this family and their traditions had reached its peak when he watched them inside the diner, but it soared now. A friend at school had told Dru about Santa when he was barely older than the twins, and his mom had only laughed when he asked her. Dru had insisted for another year that it was a joke, but not even his dad had tried to conceal anything the following Christmas. Looking back, he knew he didn't need to believe in Santa for a few more years to get the magical holidays that the Sutton boys must get every year, magical holidays that had probably started when Katie and Amber were small. But that was just one of many instances where Christmas was just another holiday to the North family. She squeezed his hand and he blinked, finding her staring at him the way she had back in the diner when he'd been lost in thoughts about how much he was enjoying himself. Dru? As you could probably already tell by what I told you, my family doesn't have cool traditions like that, so I'm thinking how awesome it would have been to have a dad like Will. He sighed and gave a shrug. It might be too late for you, although, she tapped her finger against her chin, making Dru laugh. But in all seriousness, you can be that dad. Someday. Later, of course. Like, not now. Or not that I'm saying I think that we. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, lingering over the touch for a moment. Regret flitted through him again that he hadn't taken her up on her offer that morning, but only for an instant. His gut told him that getting to know Amber beyond the days he had to spend in Little River would definitely be worth it. She was perfect, and in one day he thought he might have discovered that she was everything he wanted. I know you did that so I wouldn't see you laughing at me, she murmured. He pulled away and smiled at her. Your family is waiting. He nodded toward the Suburban, and he was sure that Katie was eager to get her kids home to run off some of the sugar from the afternoon. You know, there's not technically room in there for me. Chad threatened to make me ride in the trunk. She let a smile stretch across her lips, so slowly and tantalizing that it nearly undid him. Bum a ride, she asked. Of course. He walked her around his car, opening the door. He leaned in close, enjoying how her breath hitched with his face inches from hers. Thank you for an amazing afternoon, he said softly. She studied him for several seconds. It was just part of a movie, a bunch of crazy kids, and some hot chocolate, she whispered back. And that's what made it awesome. He ran his fingers over her cheeks, and her eyes fluttered closed. You're making it really hard to believe all that stuff they say about you, Dru North, she said, sliding slowly away and dropping into the passenger seat of his car. He grinned down at her. About time. Chapter 8. Amber's mouth dropped open as her brother-in-law stepped from the bathroom off the guest room that he and Katie were staying in, dressed in slick black spandex from head to toe. Only a sliver of space exposed his eyes. We don't stand a chance, she breathed. Katie burst into laughter. You have finally cracked, babe. Chad is 15, Will said, his voice slightly muffled by the fabric covering his mouth. I have to up my game. And what are you going to do if he just decides to stay up all night waiting for you? Katie raised her eyebrows at him. Will pulled off the mask. That's where Amber comes in. She's going to give me a signal if Chad's trying to trick me. Whoa. Amber held up her hands. I don't know if I can betray the boys like that. I'm supposed to be on their side tonight. Will put his hands on his hips. I have 6 boys, Amber. When you have kids, what kind of revenge do you think I can exact for your betrayal of the parental code? Both women started laughing, and Katie got up and shoved her husband back into the bathroom. You're taking this far too seriously. I mean it, Amber. Will pointed at her while stumbling backward under Katie's direction. I will remember. Katie returned to the bed where she had been sitting after she'd closed the door on him. He won't remember, she said. We're talking about the guy who took 3 weeks to remember Cade and Colby's names. In his defense, he had 5 previous boys, all with C names. Amber kicked her feet up on the small, circular ottoman in front of the little armchair she sat in. Don't take his side on this. Katie wagged a finger at her. Even you've said that the first year with them was a total blur. As the little sister, she still enjoyed pushing Katie's buttons. Katie recognized the smirk and shook her head. Because I was getting up every 2 hours to feed them, while that man could snore through a train coming through the bedroom. Will came out of the bathroom, dressed in his jeans and t-shirt again, and headed for the door. I'm gonna go practice sneaking around the family and see how much I can get away with while the boys are awake. He didn't wait for a reply as he left. You're taking this too seriously. Katie called after him, but she was grinning. She got a kick out of the lengths her husband went to make the holiday special, in his way, for their boys. She turned back to Amber. So, you and Dru, you looked pretty cozy today. Amber waved her off. It's just a fling, Katie. No big deal. Katie opened her mouth, probably to protest, but Amber cut her off. For real. He's Dru North, and he's playing small-town guy right now, the way he plays sexy bad boy to the media. I know that, and I'm okay with it. He's fun and this is fun. He took 6 boys to get hot chocolate today and let Cade and Colby climb all over him at the movie. He didn't even look bothered, Amber. That's not some part he's playing so he can make out with you or something. Amber blushed at the something her sister was likely implying, especially given Dru's reputation. I'm not saying that, she said, ignoring the heat in her cheeks. I think he enjoyed that. His family isn't big and crazy like ours, but he took the challenge I gave him to take me on 12 dates before I leave, and I think he's just gotten caught up in that. Katie shrugged and got up off the bed. I think he likes you. And also, I think he's never been hotter than when I looked over and saw my babies snuggled up with him. Just saying. She grabbed for Amber's hand. Come on, let's go help Mom make sugar cookies and mourn that we didn't think to shove a bunch of Bellamy's in our pockets last night. You need to move back to Little River, Amber said. Then you could sneak off to eat at the ranch house all the time. Katie's eyes brightened. I have never heard a better argument than that one right there. I'm going to tell Will. Chapter 9. Dru had bribed Bellamy into boxing up a half-dozen of her biscuits and putting a bow on top, which he figured was the best present he could get Amber's sister. He hoped it was enough of a thank you for the help she'd given him the day before in getting to go out with Amber. He pulled into the curved driveway of the Miller home behind the Sutton Suburban. He couldn't help the wide grin on his face. Amber was going to be bowled over by the present he'd gotten up very early this morning to arrange. He was pretty sure he'd nailed it, totally. Being able to do things like this for his friends was definitely one of the bonuses of being rich. He took a moment to arrange everything before he got out of the car and hurried up the front porch. He held the gift bag for Amber carefully in both hands and the box of biscuits under his arm. Amber came to the door when he knocked, which would make this all the easier. Good morning. She smiled up at him. You missed them opening their presents from Ninja Santa, but there's still plenty of pancakes left. Come in. She took his arm and tugged on it. Dru couldn't wait to hear about how Will had managed to fool his boys. Katie, this is for you. And I'd suggest hiding it from everyone else. He held out the box of biscuits. Katie's eyes widened as she hurried forward for the box. She peeked inside and gave a gasp of glee. Dru? Are you kidding me? Dru just laughed. And the gift bag he'd shifted to cradle in one hand gave a small yip. About that moment, the beagle puppy he'd driven down to Casper to pick up early that morning poked his head above the tissue paper Dru had lined the bag with before putting her inside. Amber echoed her sister's gasp, looking at Dru with furrowed eyebrows. Dru, what is that? Your Christmas present. He held out the gift bag to her, his grin widening so much he thought it would slip past his cheeks. What? Amber whispered and reached into the bag to pull the sweet little thing out. You're totally kidding. Dru stared at her, confused. She wasn't excited or bouncing or smiling like he thought she would. Katie was definitely more excited about her simple gift, having already dug one biscuit out of the box and taking a furtive bite before stuffing it back in. Amber's lips had turned down into a frown, something he didn't think possible while someone had a tiny beagle puppy nestled next to their face. But Amber was staring at him like he'd done something completely crazy. And maybe it had been a little much to drive 3 hours, round trip for a girl he just met, but he wanted to show her that the last couple days had really meant something to him. Something he intended to pursue beyond the 12 dates and 10 days they had. He'd known that from their first dance the night of the ranch house party. "Auntie, can I see the puppy?" Cade, or Colby, reached up toward the puppy, eyes bright and eager. That had been the look he'd been hoping for from Amber. "Just a minute, sweetie." Amber forced a smile at him and then nudged Dru toward the nearby kitchen. "We need to talk," she said in a low voice. She turned back to her nephews, who were all in various stages of coming over to see the puppy. The other twin stood right behind his brother, and the other 2 younger Sutton brothers were making their way through the wrapping paper in his direction. "Isn't it nice of Dru to bring this pretty puppy for a visit?" she said brightly, so much falseness to the tone that Dru wondered if the boys saw through it too. Katie was chewing on her lip, glancing between Dru and Amber and the box in her hands. "I'll be right back so we can play with it after I talk to Dru about what the rules are. It's a super special puppy." With that, she pushed Dru past the archway of the kitchen and straight through it to a second living area on the other side. Behind them, he could hear Katie urging her boys to stay back and wait, even though at least 2 of them were whining about wanting to play with the puppy. "I didn't bring this puppy for a visit," he said when he was alone with Amber. She took a long breath and avoided his gaze. "That's all this could be, Dru. You can't give me a beagle for Christmas." He slapped his forehead. He'd been so excited about finding something meaningful for her he hadn't thought about practicalities. "I didn't even think about if you could have dogs at your apartment." "Shoot, Amber." She shook her head. "I can have a dog, Dru." But before he could feel relieved about that, she scowled again. "This is a $500 dog. You can't just give me a $500 dog for Christmas. That's crazy. I didn't pay $500. For some reason the price was important. Maybe because it represented a seriousness that he felt and she didn't? He couldn't say. He also swallowed back any offers to pay for some of the expenses, other practicalities that hadn't crossed his mind until a few minutes before. She arched a brow at him. "Where did you get a beagle on Christmas morning, or Christmas Eve or whenever?" He kept his mouth shut. If she was balking at him getting a dog for her, she wouldn't like how far he'd driven to do it. "Dru." The puppy licked Amber's face, but she still managed to scrutinize him the way his manager did when Dru wanted to soften up the image they were portraying. "I know how this looks, but it doesn't need to be a big deal. I just wanted to show you that I'm not the guy you think I am. That this thing between us, I want it to be more than a holiday fling." He held out his hands, praying for her to understand that he couldn't bear to let her go after New Year's. He'd seen a glimpse into a possible future. He didn't want to call anything yet, it had only been 2 days, but he wanted to see where it went. This girl and her family was everything he dreamed of for years. She was shaking her head. "This is a big deal. A really big deal. I didn't even think to get you anything." "That's fine. I didn't expect you to. This isn't a Christmas gift, really. I can't keep her." Amber swallowed, tuning her attention to the dog and avoiding his gaze again. "But the boys will love playing with her today," she went on in a rushed tone, not giving him any chance to contradict or argue or try to convince her. "I'm sorry that you went to all the trouble. She's gorgeous," she added in a whisper before whirling and hurrying back to the living room where her family waited. Dru rubbed the back of his neck before he followed, trying to figure out what it all meant. He got that it was rash and maybe far past crazy, but he just wanted to make some kind of gesture. Amber had talked so fondly about her old dog. They'd texted late last night while she waited for her nephews to fall asleep, Everything from how Will expected her to betray the boys to how much she'd loved her dog and wanted to get another one eventually. He thought it was the cost holding her up, justifying spending a few $100s on a dog on her small teaching salary in addition to the expenses that would follow. It had been an impulsive decision on his part to get one for her, and he obviously should have thought it through better. Yeah, it was too soon in their relationship for this kind of gift, but was she not falling as fast as him? Did Amber not see this going any further than their time in Little River? And what was he going to do with a beagle? Chapter 10. Amber didn't blame Dru for escaping after only a couple hours. Things had been different, tense and awkward since their conversation in the kitchen. Maybe she hadn't said it well, but she'd frozen up when she'd seen him holding out a $500 purebred beagle out to her. It wasn't like when Carson had expected her to buy expensive dresses or eat expensive dinners with him when they were together, but the attitude felt similar. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? Carson had said it so much that the minute Dru had used a similar phrase, Amber had known it was time to make things clear. She couldn't keep up with Carson's world. And Dru was probably far richer. How could she ever keep up with that? She had told her sister that this was just a fun, holiday fling, but part of her had daydreamed about what dating Dru long-term would be like. She'd forgotten to consider the awards shows where she'd have to look like she belonged with the other musicians, actresses, and models who walked the red carpet. That was more than just expensive dresses, it meant hair and makeup and hours at the salon. In her mind she'd glossed over the fact that Dru would surely have to entertain executives too, and far higher rollers than at Carson's firm. Wonder who he borrowed this pretty thing from, Katie said, reaching over to stroke the puppy's baby soft fur. Dru had escaped, but he'd left the puppy for the day, and said he'd grab her from Amber when she came back to the ranch house. She didn't have the heart to tell him no, not when the boys begged her desperately to let the puppy stay, please, Auntie. Plus they'd been incredibly helpful with the dog in addition to playing with her, especially the older ones who'd been vigilant about taking her outside regularly to do her puppy business, so accidents wouldn't add to the chaos of the day. Don't get on me about this, Katie. It's crazy. The only thing keeping Amber chill about it was the rhythmic motion of stroking the dog. She'd finally gotten the puppy away from the little boys, claiming the puppy needed to rest. Which was probably true. The boys were enamored. I agree. Katie nodded and sighed. But I think you were hard on him. He acted rashly and did something crazy, yes. But he understood that pretty quickly, and you still gave him the cold shoulder. Have you explained about Carson? I don't think Dru would be like him, expecting so much from you. No, Dru would insist on buying it all for me, and I think I might hate that more. She bit down on her lip to keep from crying. This was ridiculous. She'd known Dru a total of 2 days. But money aside, this puppy had been a very thoughtful gift. And it had begun to feel like she and Dru had an inescapable connection meant to last beyond Christmas. I'm a terrible cook, Katie said. Amber turned to her sister, scowling at the out-of-the-blue comment. I know. I've always figured that's why you worship Bellamy. Katie gave a short laugh. Will is amazing. You know how hard it was for me to accept that even though I'm the mom, I shouldn't be the one cooking? That's supposed to be me, taking care of my kids and my husband. But Will and I both have to lean on each other for things. That's how love works, sweetie. Amber stared at the puppy. This is different. Maybe. Katie reached for the puppy, wrenching it gently from Amber's grasp. But would Dru still be here if he weren't rich? If he were some guy in town visiting his family? Amber didn't answer and still avoided her sister's gaze. That seems unfair, Katie finished. Amber opened her mouth to protest, but Katie waved it away. Can we have your puppy? I'll probably regret this decision in a week, but this fluffy thing is melting all my insides. I have no resistance. Amber leaned her head on Katie's shoulder. I think that's a great idea. The boys are so smitten. And insisting that they take care of her will be a great way to assure that none of them are entitled. Katie snorted. She peered toward the kitchen where the boys were racing toy cars across the floor. All those presents, and they've been doing that over an hour now, she mused. They're good kids, Katie. You know who else thinks so? Katie smirked. I've never seen anyone adjust to those hooligans as effortlessly as Dru. Amber glared and snatched the puppy back. I can still keep her, you know, and disappoint your children.
Meh.
I've dealt with that before. Threaten me with something that's actually scary, Amber. She bent over and pressed her nose into the puppy's face and then laughed as she went to join her boys in the kitchen. Dru got halfway through the cheesy romantic Christmas movie that Roxy and Bellamy had insisted they watch before Roxy commented on his presence at her and Tag's house. Thought you'd spend as much time at the Millers as you could get away with today. She raised her eyebrows at him from where she sat next to Tag. She must have gotten sick of him sooner than we thought, Tag commented without looking away from the movie, though Dru didn't know, for the life of him, what the draw was to this thing. Little River women aren't like those models you usually date. Tag chuckled to himself and Dru joined him. If anyone knew how little truth there was to those rumors, it was his mentor. Amen, he said though, wishing that it didn't weigh as heavy as it sounded. He meant to add to the joke, but too much truth had come through. There were plenty of down-to-earth musicians he'd dated over the years, actresses and models too. None of them would have reacted the way Amber did to his surprise puppy. Logically, he could understand that to her it was different, but it bothered him that she worried so much over him giving her something she maybe couldn't afford herself, at least not on the impulsive whim that Dru had bought it. And in hindsight, giving someone a live animal for Christmas without really talking to her about it had been dumb. The more he'd thought about it over the afternoon, the more he'd regretted it, especially the things he hadn't considered of before. They'd barely talked in the couple hours he'd spent at her mom's house with her, and in the intervening hours since he'd left, she hadn't answered the "I'm sorry. Can we talk?" text he'd sent. He needed a chance to explain what he'd done and why. He'd wanted to give her something meaningful, but clearly he should have thought a lot smaller. Roxy studied him closer, leaning away from Tag to rest her elbow on the arm of the large sofa. What happened? She asked. The change in her tone must have alerted Tag to the seriousness of her inquiry. He pulled his attention from the movie to Dru, his inquiring gaze echoing his wife's question. I bought her a dog for Christmas. She told me no way, and now I think the whole thing has gone up in flames. He shrugged, trying to play it off and ignore how bothered he was by the chance that the brief fling, to use Amber's words, was over. Bellamy leaned forward from her seat on a chair across the room. What kind of dog and where did you get a present like that so quickly? Heat flooded Dru's face. Is this like group therapy for rejection or what? Tag's lips quirked, but Bellamy continued to stare at him. You can try to ignore her, Roxy said, glancing at her husband. But she thinks she knows everything, so she'll just insist on telling you what to do. Dru had to laugh. He'd heard the story of how Tag had finally won Roxy over by convincing Bellamy to champion his cause. Listen. Bellamy fixed them all with a haughty stare. I just happen to know when things are totally right, and they've been totally right for Dru and Amber since they came downstairs together. Dru sighed and gave in. A beagle like the one she had when she was younger, and I got it in Casper. So, expensive? Bellamy guessed. She was nodding slowly before Dru even confirmed it. Has she told you anything about her ex, Carson? No, but even though it doesn't seem like it, we've only known each other a couple days. Even in the normal course of dating, exes wouldn't have come up yet. He leaned forward now too, wondering what Amber's ex-boyfriend might have to do with the way she'd reacted to his gift. Was there more to this than him giving her a way too extravagant, way too complicated gift way too soon? You should ask her to tell you about him. I know usually guys don't want to know that stuff, but in your case, it would help. Bellamy pressed her lips together and sat back in her chair, turning back to the movie and making it clear that she wouldn't tell anything she already knew. So Dru sat back too. Okay. He hoped it would shed some light on things, and that Amber would give him a second chance. Chapter 11. Dru flung open the door of his room at the ranch house that evening by the end of the third knock, smiling when he saw Amber standing in the hall. Despite what had happened that day, the evening was brighter just by seeing her. "Hey," he said softly, then glanced at her arms. "No, puppy." "Hey." She offered a forced smile, one that sort of twisted his insides, but he didn't give up hope. Maybe with a good talk he could smooth things over. Is it okay if I keep my puppy and, well, share it with my nephews?" She gave a "what do you do" shrug. "You don't have to do that because you feel bad. You shouldn't feel bad. This was all my stupid idea. The boys love her, and Katie loved Bailey as much as I did, so she wants to give them a piece of her childhood. I just wanted to make sure that was okay with you, that you hadn't already made plans to return her or whatever." "Of course. Stupid as my idea may have been, she's your puppy. Care for her as you see fit." He offered her a hopeful smile. "Thank you for understanding." "It's not that I didn't like her." Amber backed up a step, but Dru held out a hand. "I know. Can we talk, please?" He pulled the door open wider, inviting her in and gesturing to the gray couch in the far corner. Sure." She hesitated, then came inside, admiring the room as she did so. Dru shut the door about 3/4 of the way, leaving a generous shaft open in hopes that it would make Amber more comfortable being alone with him in his room. Today had proven that they didn't know each other as well as it felt like they did, and he didn't want to do anything that might make that worse. He perched on the ottoman across the couch from her, scooting it back so there were a few inches of space between their knees. "I'm sorry about this morning. I obviously should have talked to you before I dropped a dog in your lap." She drew in a long breath. "It was thoughtful, and I know where you were coming from, it shows how different our worlds are." She looked apologetic, and Dru got the feeling this was about more than a puppy and more than their financial states. He studied her for a moment. "Bellamy told me I should ask you about your ex, Carson." Amber gave a short, dry laugh. "Bellamy told you? I want this on her if it goes south. I've already met my quota of screw-ups today." Dru held up his hands in surrender. "He works for an international investment banking firm. He travels a ton and rolls in some fancy circles." She shrugged, her shoulders tight. "Dating him required a financial commitment from me, for lack of a better way to put it. Dinners with big-time clients meant I had to look a part, an expensive part. It bothered him that I didn't travel with him ever, but even though the hotels were usually paid for, I had to get myself there. And take off work. It was too much to ask of you," Dru finished, trying to keep his tone neutral and not accusing. Whatever Carson's faults, Dru didn't think Amber would appreciate him showing his real opinion of this too much. Besides, he had little room to talk. He'd shown just as much disregard for her feelings when he bought her a puppy for Christmas without thinking it through. Maybe, yeah, he never saw what the big deal was with a new dress or taking off to New York with him. She stared down at her hands now. He scooted forward and tentatively reached out for them, brushing them gently at first and then taking them in his when she didn't pull away. "And today I acted like an expensive dog wasn't that big of a deal." She nodded. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to prove that this was more than a fling to me, and I went too far. I've never seen the point of having this money if I couldn't spend it on whatever I wanted." She flinched at his wording, and inwardly he cursed himself. Careless with his money, that's what it looked like to her. "I just wanted to do something I knew would make you happy." It was a good thought. Plus the boys love her, so in the end, I guess it turned out okay. She gave his hands a squeeze. But she was still awkward with him, and that wasn't okay. He had to fix that somehow. "Can we start today over? Give me a redo," he asked. She relaxed a little. "I can't recreate the moment when the boys got up super early and went in search of wherever Ninja Santa had hidden the presents, in an effort to trick them, and he swooped in and left them all on top of their sleeping bags." Dru burst into laughter. "Brilliant. I can't imagine we'll got any sleep prepping for that moment." She sat back into the couch, her grin more genuine than anything he'd seen since she'd answered the door at her parents' house that morning. I have something for you, but don't judge until you see it, he hurried to add when her shoulders tightened again. He went to the big dresser, taking a small box off the top and bringing it back over to her. She slowly lifted the lid, her lips forming a thin line as she peered inside. Then she burst into laughter and pulled out the oversized sugar cookie he'd boxed up. He'd managed to cram, "Merry Christmas, Amber." Drew over the small thing and had piled it high with icing. "I made it myself," he said, donning a mockingly proud demeanor. "I see that." Her voice shook with laughter as she lifted it out. "Okay, I might not be the best at decorating yet, but the cookie is very, very good. Believe me." He nodded at her expectantly, waiting for her to take a bite. She obliged, carefully biting into the edge. Her eyes widened. "Don't be mad," she said around a mouthful of the cookie. She scraped most of the frosting off on the side of the box, which he just laughed at, and then took another bite. "Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
You really can bake." He bowed. "Yes. I can." She took another bite and finished it before speaking again. "This is an awesome gift. For future reference, this is a very good I've only known you 2 days Christmas gift." Noted. He sat down next to her on the couch, resting his arm across the top. "You up for a cheesy Christmas movie?" She snuggled up next to him. "Can we go find some more of those cookies first?" "I thought you might say that." He wiggled his eyebrows at her and jumped up. "Care to sneak downstairs to the kitchen with me?" He held out a hand to her. She reached up and took it, though he couldn't help noticing there was still hesitation in her eyes. "I'd like that," she said. Chapter 12. Amber slept in the next morning. She hadn't gotten a lot of sleep on Christmas Eve. Chad kept nudging her awake when she drifted off, insisting they had to be vigilant if they were going to catch his dad. It made the time she spent in the huge, soft bed in her room at the ranch house all the better. She didn't feel guilty about the long bath she took either. She paused as she got ready to leave the room and head over to her parents' house. She had to give Dru credit for his apology and for understanding how bothered she was about the big gift. She'd had fun with him the night before too, pretending to sneak down the stairs even though he knew that Bellamy was still down at Tag and Roxy's house. They'd laughed and joked as they ate cookies in the kitchen and then made fun of the cheesy Christmas movie he picked out to watch. She'd started thinking maybe it was okay to consider something more with Dru. He'd understood about how Carson's expectations had been difficult for her. But he was still Dru North. He might do his best not to make her feel the way Carson had, but it would be unavoidable at some point. The further she let the daydream go, the more they'd fall into the fantasy that somehow this would be different than her and Carson's relationship, even though there were so many similarities. But maybe she could convince him to forget about the future and just have some fun with her. She enjoyed Dru's company, and he had confided in her the night before about how jealous he was of her family and the crazy but joyous holiday they were enjoying. How could she take away his opportunity to have the family holiday he'd always wanted just because she didn't see this lasting for them? She pulled open her door before she had a chance to overthink her decision. She marched across the hall and knocked on Dru's door to invite him to come play games with her family for what was left of the afternoon. Every moment seemed to remind her that letting him in was a mistake, and not because things were awkward like they had been the day before. Like the afternoon at the movie theater and then at the diner, Dru fit so well. His eyes lit up as he tumbled into a 6-boy wrestling match, teaming up with Will to try and beat the Sutton boys. It was Dru who convinced the twins to turn against their brothers, leading to their victory. Amber had ignored Katie's knowing smirk as she laughed so hard her sides hurt and spent a good deal of the match gazing, smitten, at Dru. He was stealing her heart, just like he'd said he would, and Amber began to worry she wouldn't be able to let him go, at least not without losing those parts of her heart that he'd already made off with. He dragged himself away, and not without difficulty, later that afternoon, then texted Amber and asked her if she'd like to go down to the diner with him to get pie. Her fingers typed yes, before she really got control, which was the point where she decided that she absolutely had to get this fling back into fling territory. "Honestly, I thought fitting 12 dates into 10 days was going to be difficult," but it's only day 4, and I'm already 3/4 of the way through, Dru said as he slid into the corner booth after her. It was ridiculous that the two of them took up this huge table, but the diner was mostly empty, and when Dru asked Addie for it specially, she hadn't even hesitated before leading them that way. 3/4, Amber scoffed, shaking her head at him. We have not been on 8 dates. The Christmas party. He held up a finger. Amber broke in before he could go on. That does not count. I walked you to the party and back to your room that night. Kissed you and spent as much time dancing with you as I could. That absolutely counts as our first date, he said. Amber scrunched up her nose, but he went on. Breakfast the next morning. He held up another finger, and although Amber rolled her eyes, she didn't contradict him this time. The movie and then the diner. He ticked off fingers 3 and 4. Laughter spilled from Amber. Oh, no. I'm drawing the line there. Dinner and a movie, 1 date. Plus it wasn't even dinner. It was hot cocoa and fries, which I had to share with 3 other dates. Fine. Dru's voice shook with laughter of his own as he took down the 4th finger. Christmas morning, and don't even try to strike that. Every couple has an awkward date or 2. Couple. Amber's brain stuck on the word, but she tried not to show it. Okay. Then a movie that night. He held up 5 fingers. Games with your family. 6. And dinner right now. 7 dates, although I'm saying you cheated me out of 1. Protest noted. She scooted closer in the booth. Now was the perfect time to derail Dru's plans to happily ever after. If she didn't stop him now, he would have her believing that this would all turn out fine. She ran her fingers over the front of his long-sleeved t-shirt. The baseball tee style made his shoulders seem broader and his toned arms more muscled. He stilled underneath her touch and didn't move when she leaned up into him, placing her lips inches from his. You totally deserve a reward, she whispered. Dru laughed softly, keeping the few centimeters of distance between their lips unchanged. I know what you're doing, he said with a slight sing-song lilt to his voice. And what is that? She asked. Trying to convince yourself this isn't anything more than a fling. He raised his eyebrows at her. She pulled back and glared at him. Do all women have to work this hard to kiss you? She folded her arms. Yes. Amber flinched at the ever so slight chill to his voice and then swallowed, trying to shove away the sincerity that shone through. How many times do I have to tell you not to believe everything you've read about me online? He continued in a gentler, more understanding tone. She studied him for several seconds. Then why do you let people say it? He sat back in the booth, putting his arm casually over the top of the seat on his other side. But his shoulders were tight, and he sighed as he answered. It doesn't matter what I say. Okay, so he wouldn't let her kiss him and keep this thing meaningless, but she could work with this to show him why they wouldn't work out in the long run. They were too different. His image mattered to him, using it to sell records and be successful was worth the awful things people said. Maybe not now, with your cultivated image. He tensed more. Not ever, he countered. He leaned forward, clasping his hands and resting his elbows on the table. Right before a tailgating first made it big, I went to Vegas with Remington. Amber nodded. She remembered the online gossip about that trip. Rem was trying to stay clean. He asked me to go to keep him accountable. It was his 25th birthday, and he still wanted to celebrate. Of course I said yes. Dru turned his gaze to the table. Amber wanted to reach out for his hands, sensing that he needed some comfort. But she had started this, and she had done it to prove something to Dru. She had to see it through and make him understand. Some old friends of his came, and when we wouldn't party with them, they partied anyway, on his tab and throwing around his name. By the next morning, the news had broken that rehab had been useless for Rem, and that I was a bad influence. Dru gave a sharp, hard laugh. Our publicity teams spent days trying to get the truth out, and maybe some people believed our side, at least the important people, but the damage was done. Then sales went up on a tailgating and my team quit trying. Women were fawning over the bad boy, my album was soaring, and the label decided they'd hit on what they needed to sell my music. He finally looked up and met her eyes. The people who know me, Amber, know me. He stared at her, hard and reaching, a plea for her to understand that the only thing that mattered to him was the trust of his friends and family. She shook her head. That had backfired. She was having a harder and harder time remembering that he could be the most lovable man in the world, sincere to his very core, and he would still buy a $500 puppy on a whim while she saved all she could to take her dream trip to Europe someday. You are being very difficult, Dru North. His face lit in a wide smile, breathtaking and marvelous. That, honey, is the one thing you can believe about me. Dru had her hooked. Amber couldn't deny it, so as she lay in bed that night, she made sure to do a dive into the person he was to the rest of the world. She searched him online, seeking to remind herself how she couldn't keep up with his big world and stardom. It surprised her to see a new article that she hadn't read yet. Online news had been quiet about Dru the last few days with him tucked away in Little River, nothing besides a few lines of commentary of him spending holidays with family man, Taggart Du Bois. Star Dru North set to purchase 500-acre ranch outside of Nashville for $20 million. Amber frowned, wondering if the news was old. Dru already had a big place out there, he'd told her about it. Like Tag, it reminded him of his roots to live on a farm in Tennessee rather than some big mansion in California, like his manager kept pushing for to cement that party lifestyle persona. She had liked that he'd hung on to this piece of himself. She chewed on her lip as she read the article. Dru's words about not believing everything she read online pinged inside her brain with every sentence. The article insinuated that he'd bought it just to have another stunning property to his name, but his voice had held so much sincerity tonight. His publicity team was obviously letting the media think what they wanted. She clicked out of the article. She trusted Dru. There must be an explanation, and after only a few dates, he didn't really owe her one. In the meantime, she was going to believe the man he was showing her, even if it meant that her heart might get a tiny bit battered when the holiday was over. Getting to know the real him might be worth it. Chapter 13. By New Year's Eve, Dru had his 11th date and a promise that Amber would attend the town New Year's Eve party at the diner with him. The last few days had been some of the best dates he'd ever had. He enjoyed Amber's company so much that the hours he would spend apart so he could get her to let him have more than one date a day moved slow. And resisting her attempts to make sure this was all just a fling were getting harder and harder. He blinked when he stepped inside the diner with Amber. The homey space had been completely transformed. The huge corner booth was covered in food that Bellamy and a man Dru didn't recognize were arranging. The tables in the center of the room had been removed and a dance floor added. Already a handful of couples swayed to a slow 40s number played by a live band that had come in from Casper. Lights and silvery decorations had made the space almost unrecognizable as the diner it had been just a few days before. It's been so long since I came to this party, Amber breathed as she twined her arm with his and leaned in closer. It's so pretty. I'd forgotten how much Addie loves decorating the diner like this. She turned and looked up at him. She always wanted to make the diner a more upscale place, but she knows Little River can't support something like that. Would you like to dance? He asked, slipping his hand down into hers. He liked the feel of her next to him like this, but he also liked showing her that he was more down to earth than she thought he was. Having her arm through his felt more like a date to an awards show. Holding her hand felt like she might be his for longer than a couple more days. Of course. She smiled up at him. Every date the last few days had gotten her closer and closer to admitting that she was falling for him like he was for her. He twirled her gently here and there as they danced to an instrumental version of White Christmas. Dru was impressed with the band, which had two great trumpeters wailing out the jaunty rhythms of the song, not to mention the well-played drums, the double bass, and the keyboarder. Amber laughed at him as he sang quietly to her, improvising to imitate the way Bing Crosby would have sung it. So, this is my 12th date, he said softly after they danced for a while. She gave him a mockingly innocent look. Is there something special about that number? Have I convinced you that I'm serious about getting to know you? He asked, leaning over her. You've earned your kiss. She smiled and tilted her chin. He couldn't help but laugh. Still refusing to accept his intentions, but he wouldn't let that deter him. The last few days had convinced him that she was worth the fight and that he was slowly winning her over, even if she didn't want to admit it right now. He'd take his hard-won kiss and use it to show her just how much chemistry they had, in addition to their growing friendship. Make him too hard to resist. He slipped his fingers through hers again and led her off the dance floor and toward the empty diner kitchen. Pink rose in her cheeks when he cupped them in his hands and then pressed his lips down to hers. 8 days had been worth the wait for this again. Knowing Amber better, the way he'd seen these lips stretch into a smile or break into a boisterous laugh, how they kissed the soft hair of the twins, it made the privilege of having them on his all the better. He put his hands on her hips, lifting her slightly as he deepened the kiss, his skin tingling at the small sigh she gave against his lips. It reminded him of some lyrics that Raneé had written a few months ago but that his manager had said were too tender for Dru. This first time that I kiss you will be the last time that I kiss someone. For the first time. He sang the lyrics in his head, loving them even more than he had before. He took a breath and moved an inch or so away so he could stare at Amber's face a moment. His manager didn't want to insinuate that Bachelor Dru North was anywhere close to being ready to settle down. Give it a few years, he kept saying. This woman made him think very differently about that song. About how many of the ones that he and Raneé had written over the last year, that Dru had tucked away for when he could soften up his image a little. Amber opened her eyes. Dru, she whispered, then her lips stretched into a smile that he couldn't help planting a light kiss on. You were humming, she whispered when he pulled away again. Job hazard, he excused, fingering a strand of her hair. He gave her a shrug, even as his heart rate continued to rocket. He couldn't say yet that he loved Amber Miller, but he wanted to. He wanted to love her for a very long time. He took her hands in his. When is your next school break? He asked. Can I come and see you? She stiffened in his arms, and her breath hitched. She took a step back. He studied her, confused. He hadn't asked her to fly out to Nashville, or for him to fly her out next weekend, which he'd really like to do. He knew it would take time before Amber was comfortable with the difference in their salaries. With him spending money on her the way he wanted to. She took another step back. This is just a Christmas vacation thing, Dru. She was shaking her head at him. He didn't reach out for her again like he ached to do, but he could see her walls coming back up. The last thing he wanted to do was throw himself over those walls and insist she listen. She'd only push him away more. This is not a Christmas thing for me. I thought I made that clear. He took a deep breath. I thought maybe you were feeling it too. The last few days have been amazing. She held her hands up like he'd come at her the way he forced himself not to. She took another step back. He had to put his own hands in his pockets to keep himself from stopping her retreat. I'm a teacher, Dru. You are a rock star. He pressed his lips together and didn't correct her with the distinction that he sang country. Why is that a problem? She shook her head and blinked, a sheen across her eyes. You don't get that it's a problem, that's why. You buy expensive puppies for women you just met and talk about wrecking boats and a dock like someone keyed your car. You spend $20 million on a second home and jet off to all these exotic locales. She huffed out a sigh, the speed of her shaking head picking up. Little River is just another exotic locale for you. Dru clenched his jaw. The ranch was not his second home, but he was tired of trying to convince her to look beyond the surface with him. That's not true. I came from a place just like this. I know you know that. They talk about it all the time, how I couldn't wait to escape that town. He made sure he let that phrase drip with sarcasm. His own defenses rose. He tried to understand her point of view, to take down little by little the stories she'd heard of Dru over the past few years. He'd understood that he had to prove those stories wrong, not just ask her to believe and leave it at that. This week felt like she kept taking 2 steps forward with him and then another 3 back. Money changes people, she said tightly. She held up her phone, showing him a picture from his early days. Short hair, arm free of tattoos, even a little bit of a baby face that he hadn't quite grown out of yet. You should know. This time Dru took a step back, like she'd lifted her hand to slap him rather than show him a picture. If you think I was a different person with short hair and tattoos, then you don't know me at all. You haven't even tried. He spun around, heading for the door of the kitchen. Katie and Will were here, and he'd make sure before he left that they could give Amber a ride home. No. I don't think I do, she said softly from behind him. He hesitated for one step, but then moved on. He couldn't keep asking Amber to believe in him when she wasn't ready to. Chapter 14. Brienne stared at the large, open living room and kitchen area of the house and shook her head, turning back to Dru with a frown. It's too big. I think you've lost your mind. He chuckled. This is the house that came with the acreage, and you've said yourself, farm work is good work for kids who need a little order in their lives. It's done, Bri. Let whoever you need to know that you guys can accept more kids, or however that works. The middle-aged woman turned and threw her arms around Dru's waist. Has anyone told you that you throw money around like there's no tomorrow? Her words were muffled against his chest, but he caught the break anyway. He tried not to react. Brienne had meant it as a compliment, but he couldn't help but hear Amber's reprimand from 3 weeks ago when he'd surprised her with a puppy. What was it that made Brienne different? Calling him crazy but accepting the home he'd purchased for them to help more teenaged foster kids? Mama. Shania's voice interrupted the hug as she burst through the door behind them. It's got stables. Stables. Are we gonna get horses? The 17-year-old bounced up and down on her toes, staring down Brienne with wide brown eyes and an excited expression Dru had never been able to resist. He'd gotten lectures more times than he could count for the expensive guitar he'd gotten Shania, among other gifts. But Brienne, nor Shania, had ever refused them. Brienne looked up at him, her expression trying for stern but failing. Stables, Dru? You said that horse therapy is good for kids. He shrugged. You are out of your ever-loving mind, Dru North. Brienne wagged her finger at him. He grinned. How long have I been telling you, every kid in the world deserves the chance for you to love them? Brienne swatted at him, but turned away, probably to hide her shimmering eyes. Go choose a room, baby. Dru seems to be serious about this nonsense. She nudged Shania out of the entryway. I'll help, Dru said, falling into stride with her as she made her way toward the stairs. There are 10 rooms. You can't take the master from your mother, but that leaves 9 other really amazing rooms. Shania rubbed her hands together and nodded, making her tight, spiraled curls bounce on top of her head. Any others with bathrooms? Yes. Now it was Shania's turn to throw her arms around Dru as they came to a landing on the stairs. Dru, this is the best place ever. How did you talk Mama and Daddy into it? Convince them that when they're finally done raising kids that I'll take it back. And then I showed her that website with all the statistics about teenagers in foster care. You know how that always gets her. He continued up, leading the way to the second floor and the first 5 bedrooms in the home. You're so manipulative. Shania leaned away from him and shook her head in mock disappointment. He gently yanked at one of her curls, watching it spring back. I mean it when I say other kids deserve to bask in Bri and Manny's love. She poked him in the arm before continuing down the hall. You softy. If only the ladies knew. If only, he agreed with a sigh, though he was specifically thinking of one lady in particular. Should he have told Amber what he intended to do with the ranch? Would it have mattered? His phone dinged with a text as he wandered the rooms, listening to Shania's critique of all of them. I know you love this song, but let's give it to someone else if you want to get it out there for Shania. Have you talked to Tag about it? It's right up his alley. Dru clenched his teeth. He had mentioned it to Tag a few months ago, but Tag had said he thought Dru should keep it just in case he changed his mind about singing it. He'd approached his manager about it shortly after getting home from his Christmas in Little River. This time he didn't intend to take no for an answer, but Troy had been hard-headed. I want to sing it. Women like a softer side from time to time, he tapped out in frustration, pushing harder on the letters than he meant and ending up with some unintended accent marks. Amber had been listening to Be Careful with That Heart the day after they met, and it continued to be one of his best-selling songs. That had to say something. Let's keep thinking on it, came the automatic answer. Dru leaned against the wall near the door where Raneé was now roaming on the 3rd floor. She had declared earlier that she was pretty sure she wanted one of the ones on the 2nd floor, but she couldn't decide until she'd seen them all. Raneé, you got your guitar? He asked. She strode out of the room. Course. Wanna help me out with something? Like? She put a hand on her hip, popping it out to one side. Recording The Last Time I Kissed Someone on a live video. It was the only way Dru could think of around his manager's stubbornness. Having 50 million women drooling over it the way they did every time Tag serenaded his wife would say something. And telling people where we are and why. She arched an eyebrow. You know what Troy is going to say about that? That I have to take it down. She scrunched her nose like when she told him about the punk boys at school who only had trash to say about her mile-long legs. For years ago, Raneé might not have put them in their place about their dirty mouths. Brienne had taught her better now. Raneé wouldn't ever really need Dru to protect her like he'd promised in his tattoo. Let me take care of him, Dru said, his resolve growing stronger. Maybe it was time to stop working so hard at his image. Just go get your guitar. Chapter 15. It matters what he spent the money on. Amber could hear the snap to her sister's voice even over the phone. She didn't have time for this call. The huge stack of papers in front of her wouldn't get graded as long as she was on the phone. Especially talking about Dru. She'd had over a month to regret what she'd said to him in Little River. A month of realizations about the fact that maybe it was just how quickly she fell that scared her and not as much about his stardom, as she'd thought. You're right. She squinted at the next question on the paper in front of her. Eloise's handwriting was going to require full concentration today. You are saying that so I'll get off the phone, Katie huffed. Yes. But I do agree. Him dropping 20 mil on a ranch for foster kids is different than having a vacation home. Amber's heart twisted a little. What she wouldn't admit to Katie was how many times she'd watched the video. The first time, she told herself it was to put a face to the girl Dru had spoken so much about, the one he'd tattooed words to a Taylor Swift song on his arm for. The one who'd written the sweetest song Dru North had ever sung. The rest of the times, it was to pretend that when Dru was singing about the last time he'd kiss a girl for the first time, he was singing about her. Which was ridiculous. He told the viewers that Raneé had written the song months ago. Raneé had sung with him, improvising in a soulful voice that matched Dru's like honey with peanut butter, unexpected but perfectly sweet. Had Amber imagined that Dru had blushed when Raneé smirked at him and sang about magic in the air? Was she teasing her big brother about his holiday romance? Dru had talked so much about the magic he felt between them. How it must be Christmas magic bringing them together. So? Katie asked, interrupting Amber's reverie. So, what? I misjudged him and got scared and didn't give it a chance when I maybe should have. Is that what you want to hear? She shoved aside Eloise's paper, giving up until they got off the phone. It was very difficult to tell Eloise's cursive E's from her L's when she got writing quickly. That, and what are you going to do about it? Do not lick me. I've warned you. Amber just covered a snort. Her sister loved Jelly, which was what the twins had demanded they name the puppy, but she didn't love the dog licking her. That seemed to have changed in the years since they had Bailey. Fine, when you put it that way, I'll stop licking you. Better talk to Will about this too. She couldn't, however, keep her voice from shaking. Don't change the subject. I'll mope about it, she offered. It's Dru North, Katie. I can't just call him up and tell him I was wrong about him, and I should have given him more of a chance. He's probably already got a new girlfriend. Katie humphed. You know him better than that, even after only a week.
Yeah,
But Amber couldn't help wondering if he did. She wouldn't blame him for moving on. It wasn't like they'd had some epic romance. Just a little Christmas magic and a few stolen kisses. Katie sighed. He looks at you the way I look at Bellamy's biscuits. He'll answer. Do not arg. I've gotta go. The phone clicked in Amber's ear before she had a chance to respond. Or even laugh at her sister's joke. She chuckled to herself and slid the phone aside, pulling Eloise's paper back into her lap. 15 minutes later she was still trying to decipher the girl's essay on the causes of the War of 1812, which was difficult with her thoughts on the lyrics to Dru's new song, and specifically how she knew what it felt like to have his fingers tracing lines on her cheek the way he sang about. Arg. She echoed her sister's growl and tossed Eloise's paper aside. Then she picked up her phone and pulled up the message thread between her and Dru. The last one came from New Year's Eve, silly banter about when he would cross the hall to pick her up. I really like your new song. She pressed send before she could stop herself. When he didn't answer right away, she flipped her phone over and promised she would focus on grading, if only to distract herself from if Dru would really answer. After putting Eloise's paper on the bottom of the stack to come back to, she did manage nearly half an hour of focused grading before her phone dinged. She picked it up to see a text from her sister. What if I could prove that Dru would still want to see you? Would you want to see him? Yes. Amber sent and then chewed on her lip. What are you up to? Do not text him, Katie. Let me do this myself. The response she got was a devil emoji. Amber collapsed back onto the couch with a groan. When she didn't hear anything from Dru the rest of the evening, she convinced herself that she had been right about him moving on and that, for once, Katie had respected her privacy and not butted in. Maybe by the time school was over, she'd have gotten up the guts to call him and apologize for not being fair. For believing gossip reporters over him. For being too scared to trust him. She was passing out the corrected tests that had taken her far longer than usual the night before when there was a tap on her classroom door. She glanced at the window in the door and frowned at the sight of the principal, Mr. Porter. She hurried across the room to open the door, her eyes widening when she found Dru standing behind him. You have a special visitor, Miss Miller, Mr. Porter said, stepping aside and gesturing to Dru, as though the principal had been hiding him. I'll just take your class out to recess a few minutes early? He beamed at a still speechless Amber and then turned to Dru, who pressed his lips together like he was trying not to laugh.
Yeah.
That would be nice, Mr. Porter. Amber finally managed to put together some words. She and Dru moved inside the door, watching without speaking as the class gathered up their things and hurried outside with Mr. Porter, all of them glancing over their shoulders at her and Dru and then whispering with their neighbors. Amber couldn't help staring at Dru until he would catch her, and then she'd hurriedly look away. He had on a Broncos hoodie that she suspected he'd grabbed at the airport. When they were in Little River, he'd said he was a Titans fan. How did this man make something so simple look so hot? And good heavens, it was 20 degrees outside. His Tennessee but was probably freezing. When the class had all filed out, Dru turned to her. I know how you feel about me throwing around my money, so I think it's only fair to tell you that I came here to check on Jelly. A short laugh escaped her. She ignored the fact that to know the dog's name he'd have to be in contact with Katie. The proof of that was standing in front of her. There's a problem with that story, Amber said. Jelly lives in Cheyenne, with Katie. Denver was the closest airport. He shrugged. So I stopped by. Cheyenne has an airport, she countered, eyeing him. He held out his hands in an I give up gesture. I want to spend money to see you. To see you a lot. I'm begging you to figure out a way to be okay with that. She stepped closer. I am okay with you spending money to see me. A lot. She put her hands on his chest. And I'm sorry for the way I acted. For not believing in you. You more than showed me that you're not the man the media portrays. I should have listened better. He reached behind him with one hand and shut the door of the classroom. Forgiven. He dipped his head over hers. I've been thinking about you so much, honey. Same. She sighed the word as she melted into him and then took a long breath of his familiar scent. Despite the fact that it had been a month since she'd seen him, the pine and lavender smell warmed her with memories of the last time she'd kissed Dru. Could you, she whispered, playing with the strings on the hoodie. Maybe just humor me and tell me that you were singing the last time I kissed someone for me? He smiled and came a breath away from her lips. Honey, I was singing that song for you. He shifted slightly, putting his lips against the back of her cheek, next to her ear. And fair warning, Miss Miller? I think this is going to be the last time I kiss someone for the first time. She took his cheeks in her hands, pulling him back in front of her. Dru, this isn't the first time you've kissed me, she said softly, pretending seriousness. It's the first time this year. He pressed his lips to hers. She laughed against them. That works. How many dates before I can call you my girlfriend? He asked when they pulled apart after several minutes of catching up. How many can you fit in tonight? He lifted her to sit on a nearby desk before leaning into her again. As many as it takes. Epilogue. Dru stood on the front porch of the ranch house when Amber pulled up in front, smiling at her before hurrying down the porch steps and into the snow falling softly around him. It looked like this year her nephews would get their wish to have piles of snow for Christmas. Dru wrapped her up in a long hug when he met her on the sidewalk before taking her hand and leading her toward the ranch house. Can you explain something to me? He asked as they reached the door. There's a room full of rowdy boys across the hall from me. He raised an eyebrow. Katie and Will are staying here with the baby for some peace and quiet. I told her I'd take the boys over to Mom's after I said hello to you. She stepped inside the doorway and pulled her boyfriend down for another kiss. Hello? I'd like to change my accommodations, he murmured as he moved to kiss her deeply. You'd have to sleep on the family room floor with the twins, she said when they pulled away. They video chatted on a pretty constant basis, and Dru had been out to Fort Collins as much as possible, but it wasn't enough. Dru pulled back and gave a fake cringe. We might be on the outs. I made a joke about taking Callie home with me, and they got really protective. They won't even let me pet Jelly now. Poor Callie. Amber shook her head. With 6 older brothers, I find it really unlikely that she'll ever get a date. Speaking of dates. Dru took her hands and glanced around the living area of the ranch house. She followed suit, noting its emptiness, although she could hear the faint rumble of voices and footsteps above them. If you weren't counting, we've now been on 206 dates. She eyed him. Is that so? Should I list them off? He dropped one hand to reach in his pocket for his phone. Not necessary. Laughing, she pushed at his arm and then grabbed his hand back. Well. He dropped her hands and slid his arms around her waist. She leaned back to smile at him but rested her hands on his chest. She knew this week would go by too fast, and this year she planned to savor every moment of her Christmas vacation with Dru. He wouldn't need Katie to clue him in so he could sneak in time with her. I was wondering, Dru went on, how many dates you had in mind before I could propose. Amber's cheeks warmed, and she drew in a quick breath. 206, you said? Her voice came out full of air, and her heart was skittering everywhere in her chest. Dru gave her a nod, his ever-present, cheerful smile growing by the second. You're in luck, she said. That happens to be exactly how many dates you need. Perfect. He dropped a kiss on her nose and then slid to one knee, pulling out a small white box and flipping it open. Will you marry me, honey? Amber bent over and took his cheeks in her hands. Yes, she whispered as she kissed him. Yes, yes, yes. She punctuated each yes, with another kiss. A cheer rose up loudly from above them, and Amber broke apart from Dru to eye him. His shoulders shook with laughter, and he nodded to the table nearby where a phone rested against a wide, ivory-colored candle. Its camera was on and, Amber could only assume, sending video upstairs. Katie begged. I couldn't turn her down, he said, standing and holding out his hands. Hey, Chad, Amber said to the camera. I have some pointers for you. Then she proceeded to give Dru a very sloppy kiss, which both of them were laughing through by the time they pulled apart. "Welcome to the family," she whispered, grinning up at Dru. He answered by walking over to the phone and tipping it face down to the table. Then he returned and finished kissing her, which in truth only lasted a few minutes before Katie could not hold her boys back any longer, and they all pounded down the stairs, surrounding the couple with Jelly barking at their feet. As Amber stared up at Dru amidst the madness, she didn't think she'd ever seen him happier. And that was the best Christmas present she could ever get.
Thank you for listening to Dating Dru by Raneé S. Clark. We hope you enjoyed this audiobook. Please visit Raneé's YouTube channel for more sweet romance or download her books on Amazon.